Okay. Hi, I'm Senator Lowenthal, and welcome to the first hearing that we've had for the State Allocation Board, our subcommittee on audits. A little background, because this is unusual for us to have a subcommittee on this, the idea for this subcommittee was established by a unanimous vote of the State Allocation Board in February, and we had heard lots of issues regarding audits, many of them coming from school districts, that the audits are becoming increasingly onerous and burdensome that are being conducted by the OPSC. We on the board just really needed just to understand more. The concerns that we keep or that come up are that the original idea of the Leo Green School Facility Act was to increase local flexibility and accountability through shared financial responsibility, and they'd like us to revisit whether that vision still was maintained. So really what the board did was request the subcommittee study the scope of OPSC auditing authority, and if recommendations are needed, to bring back to the State Allocation Board defining that authority. The board further specified that our recommendations should try to seek a balance between our fiduciary responsibilities for bond accountability and the best use of state and local resources in conducting audits. Today we're going to focus on developing the goal for the State Allocation Board audits. It's my hope that this goal will guide us in determining appropriate audit authority. We're first going to receive an overview on the various types of audits from Elaine Howell, our state auditor. And then we're going to listen to, we're going to invite Rob Cook, who's the Executive Officer of OPSC, to provide a summary of the evolution of OPSC audit processes. That's going to be followed by Letty Boggs, a school facility program accounting expert, sharing the district's perspective on the evolution of the state school facility program and the audit processes. We're going to learn about a current audit guide process which is utilized by the Department of Education that we may look for guidance and possibly as a model for future SAB audit practices. After hearing from them, we're going to listen to the public. We're going to try to then discuss among ourselves issues regarding objectives or goals for program audits, and then we'll continue on with this as we define the scope of the OPSC audit authority at future subcommittee meetings, and then at that point make recommendations back to the larger board. At this time, I'd like to introduce our subcommittee members, not meeting. First, Kathleen Moore from the Department of Education and Scott Harvey from the Department of General Services. And I wonder if you wish to make any statement, either of you.
I think you've thoroughly covered it.
I'll look forward to participating.
Good. Let's begin with our first speaker, really on audit functions and objectives. And we're very pleased to have as the California State Auditor Elaine Howell, and also John Collins, who is her deputy, to really educate us on what are audit functions, what are objectives, and help us guide us through this through the forest.
Certainly. Thank you, Senator Lowenthal, members of the board. For the record, my name's Elaine Howell. I'm the California State Auditor. With me is John Collins. He's a deputy auditor for the State Auditor's Office in our audits division and has a significant amount of expertise in financial auditing and certainly in auditing bond measures as well. What I thought I would do today is just kind of provide you a bit of an overview about the State Auditor's Office. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with my office, but talk a little bit about the types of audits that we conduct and some of the practices that we use when we conduct audits. The State Auditor's Office has a variety of responsibilities. One of the most important responsibilities we have is to conduct audits that the legislature asks us to do. In the California legislature, there's a Joint Legislative Audit Committee, which is made up of 7 senators, 7 assembly members, and has hearings 4 or 5 times during a legislative session to field requests from members of the legislature. The committee considers those requests and then makes decisions as to which of those audits they would like us to conduct. Those primarily are what we call performance audits. They're program evaluation, looking for efficiencies and effectiveness in programs in state government. We also can look at public entities, publicly created entities as well. But we're looking at efficiency and effectiveness. In our statute, we are required to conduct what's called the single audit. This audit is getting a particular amount of attention this year with the Recovery Act. What the single audit is a combination of an audit of the state's financial statements, and those are put out by the State Controller's Office. But what my office does is we go out to a variety of state agencies and do internal control work, looking at policies and procedures, what kind of practices these agencies have in place to protect the financial records, to make sure that those records accurately reflect what those agencies are expending monies for, state dollars. In addition to that, the other piece of the single audit is looking at federal programs. The state of California on an annual basis receives between $80 and $85 billion on an annual basis from federal agencies. As I'm sure you're aware, under the Recovery Act, California, in addition to the traditional $85 billion we received last year, we're going to be receiving another close to $85 to $87 billion under the Recovery Act. So there's a tremendous amount of funds coming into California. So what we are doing is not only conducting the traditional single audit that we're required to do by law, but at recommendations of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, as well as our federal equivalent, which is GAO. It's a Government Accountability Office. They perform audits on behalf of Congress. They're encouraging audit shops like mine to get out to agencies and do some upfront internal control work, particularly agencies that have not managed a large amount of federal dollars. A perfect example is the California Energy Commission has a state energy program which, prior to the Recovery Act, would be about $4 to $5 million a year they would be managing. Under the Recovery Act, the Energy Commission may receive upwards of $200 million, which has to be spent within a very short period of time, 18 to 24 months. So clearly that's an agency that we felt we needed to get into early, take a look at their controls, because under the traditional single audit, that dollar amount, $5 million, would be relatively small. It wouldn't be material to $85 billion the state's receiving, so it would be a program that we perhaps would not necessarily look at. But in doing a risk assessment, you're seeing an agency that normally covers a small amount of money getting an avalanche, essentially, of funds under the Recovery Act. So we need to get in there. And in fact, we have commenced an audit at the Energy Commission to take a look at their internal controls to make sure that before that money comes to the state and that we start spending those dollars, that those proper controls, proper policies and procedures for managing those dollars, managing those grants they're going to award, are in place and working well. So that's an example of the type of work that we would do under the single audit. We have been asked to do bond audits. We have actually been written into some bond measures. Housing bond is an example of one that we've been asked to go in. What we do, and John can elaborate on this a little bit, is as part of the financial audit that we conduct, we do some work at the State Treasurer's Office, and we track bond authorizations and bond expenditures. So we know which bonds have been authorized, how many bonds have been issued, what the expenditures are looking like, and then we make a decision after a certain point in time. And again, it's based on a risk assessment. Get out to that particular agency. In the case of housing bonds, it's Housing and Community Development. So again, we would go out, look at what their controls, what controls they have in place, look at the bond measure to see what are the requirements that this agency has to follow in awarding or expending those bond dollars. So we're looking at the bond measure, we're looking at any other best practices or any other laws and regulations that may apply to that particular program. So that's the kind of in a nutshell the types of audit work that we do. One other area that we have been pursuing, and this was legislation that Senator Speer, when she was a senator here and sat on the audit committee, authored legislation that gave my office the authority to conduct high-risk audits. And essentially what that legislation entails, and it mirrors legislation or a program that the Government Accountability Office has had in place for about 15 years, is basically to look at issue areas or departments in the state of California that may be at risk. Risk of mismanagement, risk of wasting state dollars, risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. So we have issued a couple of reports. We're required to issue them every 2 years and basically look at issue areas. The first report we issued was in May of 2007. We just issued our update a month or so ago. And as part of that analysis, and again, it's based on risk. You'll probably hear that from some of the other auditors. You can't audit everything. It's pretty much impossible. So you have to assess risk. And based on strength of controls, based on the history of a particular department, how well has this agency managed its operations over several years. Those are the kinds of things that you would include in a risk assessment. But this high-risk report or analysis included infrastructure as an area that we thought was an important area that California legislators, whatever administration, the Schwarzenegger administration at this point in time, new administration in a couple of years, really needs to focus on infrastructure in California. And what that discussion was about is where the voters of California are passing a significant number of bond measures to improve infrastructure in California, and we need to make sure that these state agencies that are going to be managing these bonds have proper protocols in place. One thing we did look at was the governor's issued an executive order you may be familiar with back in 2007, created a 3-part accountability program essentially for managing bonds and making sure those bonds are being used appropriately. We actually took a look at that process, and we thought it was structured very well. There were 3 phases to it, an early planning stage, then kind of an in-progress accountability, and then a follow-up where you would have some follow-up audits done after a project was completed. In progress, again, may be some audit work where you want to go out and make sure that things are happening appropriately or being monitored appropriately so that when you do conduct the audit at the end, you're feeling pretty confident that that project was well managed and those funds were used appropriately. So in a nutshell, we did take a look at that program. We thought it was well structured. The majority of the agencies we looked at a sample of 6, which one was the board, and felt that all of those 6 administering agencies, including your board, had put the proper plans in place. Those plans had been approved by finance, so that first initial phase of planning had been completed, and now it's ready to move on into the in-progress phase, and then certainly the follow-up. The completion phase when those projects are completed as far as having some audit work done. When we issue an audit report, Senator Lowenthal, I'm sure you're aware, we issue recommendations. We make recommendations to those agencies. What we do during the course of an audit is we share with the agency during the audit what the issues are that we're seeing so that they can either take immediate corrective action or that they can give us some feedback and say, well, you didn't consider this information and perhaps that's not necessarily a finding anymore. So the process we have is sharing with that entity that we're auditing during the course of the audit so that when that final product, our audit report goes out with analyses, recommendations, there aren't any surprises to the agency, and they hopefully have already put some corrective action plans in place. One more little phase I'll talk about, and then I certainly will be happy to answer any questions. John and I will answer any questions you may have, is after we issue an audit report, the agency or entities that we've audited are required to respond back to us. So we have a follow-up process after that report goes public. That process is 3 different intervals. 60 days after the report has been issued, we expect a response from the entity, 6 months, and then at the 1-year anniversary of that audit report going public. Now, at the 1-year window, if that agency has not fully implemented our recommendations, we can ask that entity to continue to report to us. Again, this was legislation that Senator Speer authored so that things wouldn't fall off the radar after 1 year. In fact, those entities that have not fully implemented recommendations after a year are highlighted in a special report to the legislature that we're required to submit every January 15th. This past year was our second year for doing that. We'll have our third one coming up in January. So it's another mechanism to kind of hold agencies accountable. Legislature asks us to do work. The voters ask us to do work as far as looking at bond measures, et cetera. It's a way to get the agencies to pay particular attention to our recommendations. So that, kind of in a nutshell, is the type of work that the State Auditor's Office does. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have.
I have one question. Was the governor's executive order meant to cover also all state agencies?
Which executive order? The one related to the bond?
Yeah.
That's my understanding. It would apply to any state agency that has bond measures that they're required to manage. We actually have a report. We can provide that to the committee. It lists all the different departments that were required to submit these accountability plans for how they would manage these bond measures. And the majority of them had submitted plans. Finance had approved them. So I'd be happy to share that, provide that report to the board.
So the bond money that's covered by the State Allocation Board and what we look at, those OPSC, that would be covered by the executive order?
That's correct. In fact, as I indicated, the State Allocation Board was one of the 6 agencies that we selected in our sample when we took a look to evaluate the program that the governor's executive order intended to create.
Scott.
I really do appreciate you being here because for me it's important to understand what an audit is. And I think auditing peanuts is one thing, but auditing dollars or something else altogether. And I heard you use the term protocols more than once, and it seems to me there are protocols not only on the entity being audited, but also the auditor. And if you could give me a better sense of what you think an auditor should have as a protocol. Things that are really essential, whether it's background, whether it's training, and then since the term was used earlier this morning about what we do as a board is sometimes considered onerous, I wonder if we have to build expectations about what an audit is on those we're auditing, if there are certain things they should have procedurally. So if you could give me a sense of what should be included on both sides of an audit, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, I'll do my best, and John can help me out too. Actually, the State Auditor's Office, we're required to follow audit standards that are established by the Comptroller General of the United States. And those standards are really important, and they're very similar to audit standards that are put out by the Institute of Internal Auditors. So auditors that work for a state agency would be considered an internal auditor. So they're very similar. And some of the key standards, they have general standards, reporting standards, et cetera. The general standards talk about having the proper expertise. So when we're putting together an audit team to conduct a bond audit, we want to make sure that the individuals that we assign to that project have the necessary skills, at least some of them. Some of our junior staff, we're going to be training them. But certainly the supervisor on that project and the manager on that project needs to have some financial auditing experience, perhaps some experience auditing bonds, but we're looking to put a team together that is a good mix of expertise to be able to conduct that project. Another important standard is objectivity and being able to be independent, going into a project with no preconceived notion as to what the final result will be. You're going to report the results based on what the evidence tells you is the condition that you're finding. Some of the other standards are related to quality control. So when we talk about protocols in our office, we have very specific procedures that we follow. We have internal control checklists where we're going to go out and interview individuals, ask them about what practices do you have in place to make sure that these expenditures are appropriate. Who's reviewing the expenditures? Who's recording the expenditures? Is there someone? Are there separate individuals responsible for different sections of that particular program. Also, we go through a process of supervisory review. You want to make sure that the work that Elaine is doing is being reviewed by someone of John's expertise, where he can look at my work and say, well, I think we need to do something different here. Another part of quality control is sharing the results, as I was speaking in my opening comments, sitting down with the agency and sharing with that agency or that school district. We've looked at your controls, and here's where we think your controls are weak. What's your perspective on that? Well, we disagree, and this is why we disagree. You need to have that dialogue because there may be something as an auditor that you missed. So part of our protocol is not at the end, but during the course of the audit. As soon as you feel like you've developed an issue, sit down with the appropriate individuals at that entity we're auditing and get their perspective, because there might be something you need to reconsider. If not, then we'll continue on and have it as a reportable issue, and the agency certainly has been apprised early enough where hopefully they can take some corrective action immediately. The other thing that we do is we provide the agency a draft copy of the report, give them the opportunity to respond to it before we issue it publicly. So there is a written response published with every audit that we issue. Again, this is part of audit standards that we're required to follow by law. So laying out those protocols for my staff internally. Now, what we do when we sit down with an agency, particularly an agency that may not be familiar with my office, because state agencies are well aware of who we are and what we do, because we're in there all the time. But oftentimes we're asked to do an audit of a local entity, maybe a school district, maybe a water district, and they're not real familiar with the state auditor. Right. So when we have what we call our entrance conference, our first meeting with that agency, we sit down and we share with them, this is what to expect from us when we're going to be on site. We're going to be meeting with you frequently. We're going to be asking you for interviews. We're going to be asking you for documentation to support any assertions that you're making as management of this agency, and walking them through the whole audit process so there aren't any surprises for them. You know, be rest assured, Mr. Harvey, when we audit you, we're going to be providing you a written draft of the report so that you do have the opportunity to see it in writing. It's one thing to explain to you a finding. Oftentimes when they see an agency sees it in writing, that, wait a minute, we need to reconsider this. And so at that entrance conference, we lay all of that out so that agency at least has some comfort in knowing what to expect from my staff when they're out there conducting the audit. So I don't know if that, I hope that answered most of your questions.
Let me just probe just a little bit more Sure. on the audit side of things. I really like the idea of having an entrance conference because that does set the tone. Everyone understands what the ground was going forward are going to be. So in my book, having something like that would be important in your procedures. I was interested when you said when you're doing a single audit, and I guess OPSC does single audits when they're looking at whether the dollars have been spent properly, bond-wise or savings-wise. You look at procedures and policies and reports, so you don't just go right into looking at the dollars. You kind of look to see what other controls a local school district, in this case, has. Can you give me a sense of what are the kinds of things that you really should be looking at to make sure they have the right internal controls?
Can you answer that?
Yeah, hi, John Collins, Deputy State Auditor. So essentially, regardless of whether it's single audit or performance audit, as part of the planning phase, standards require us to review internal controls, and that can take the form of management structures, what's the environment, what are the communication practices, what kind of formality they have with regard to, say in the case of financial auditing, the authorization and posting of transactions. So it's really any variety of processes and policies and procedures that are designed to ensure that activities are really properly carried forward. And in a financial audit context, it's all about the fair representation of financial information in the financial statements. But again, with performance audits, it really depends on the nature of the objectives in terms of what kinds of processes you might expect And again, and it's based on a risk assessment, as Elaine had indicated, depending on the significance of dollar amounts and your expectations for more or less control processes can vary depending on the nature of the audit question.
Thank you, and I guess that's what we're going to be wrestling with over time. There are some words that are really fun to say, like Machu Picchu, and in this case, gagas.
Oh,
And
yeah.
a gaga is a generally accepted
Right.
government auditing
Yeah,
standard.
we call it GAGAS.
Gagas, I thought it was gaga. You see, I
Yeah,
didn't
it's
even do
GAGAS.
it right.
And those are the standards that my office is required to follow. Those are the standards that are established by the U.S. Comptroller General. And they're great standards because they do establish very specific expectations of your own staff and of your process. As John indicated, one thing that I wanted to touch on a little bit. John's absolutely right about going in and looking at materiality. You'll hear a lot, I think, about risk assessment, again, because you can't necessarily audit everything. As I was talking about the state energy program, we haven't looked at that program because it's so small. We're looking at larger programs. But now we consider it a very high-risk program because California is going to receive significant dollars under the Recovery Act. The controls may be terrific once we get out to the Energy Commission. We just don't know. But one of the things that we do anytime we start an audit, and I get this question often from the Audit Committee, is if there's already been another audit, and I know school districts are audited by independent CPA firms, and those are sent into the state of California. What my office, as part of our initial protocols in going in and talking to an agency, is we ask them, have you had any audits done in the last year or 2 years? Because one of the things that standards require you to do is look at work that's been done by previous auditors to get a feel for some of the issues, but also to determine whether or not there's work that's been done that we can rely on so we don't have to duplicate
Right.
that effort and then put that school district or that entity that we're auditing through another audit of the same issue or the same controls, et cetera. So there is specific requirement that we follow to do that upfront work. Identify what the controls are, identify policies and procedures, laws, regulations, provisions in the bond. Then one of the important questions to ask is, when's the last time you've had an audit of this particular program? Who did the audit? Let's contact that firm that conducted the work to see if there's anything we can rely on so that we minimize the disruption that an audit may cause. So that's part of our protocol as well.
Again, the public would be best served if any auditor does follow these standards, and I would like to hear if OPSC does, or if not, how we can ensure that they do, because it certainly sounds like the protocols are in place that make a better audit. And the other thing I'm going to be interested in learning over time is this risk assessment, because we can't look at every single school district. So obviously we're doing the same kind of filtering.
Exactly.
So I appreciate your comments because it gives me a better sense of what to look out for as
and really focusing on audit standards, I think, is very, very important because it does establish protocols. It certainly establishes credibility, too, because we can sit down, oftentimes we're delivering bad news to an agency, but they know that we have followed certain protocols. We have a very strong quality control process where anything we put out on the street has to be supported by evidence, and we have our management staff review that work to make sure it's solid before it goes out. Doesn't say we're perfect, but we're pretty darn close. Sharing that information with the agency, giving them the opportunity to provide their perspective and publishing that in the report, I think goes a long way. The other thing related to standards is, and I don't know how the Institute of Internal Auditors conducts it, but my office, as part of following standards, has to have an external review every 3 years. So our counterparts in other states, so a team of state auditors from other states in the United States will come into my office. In fact, they came in last fall, and they will look at our procedures manual. They'll look at our training records to make sure our employees are getting properly trained, and meeting standards, because the Yellow Book, which is GAGAS, requires 80 hours every 2 years for our audit staff. Our CPAs have to have a certain amount of technical hours to maintain their license. We make sure that happens. But what that external peer review does is it comes in and it takes a hard look at our practices to make sure that we're following those standards. And in any areas where we may be week, that's where we need to tighten up our controls. But it's a very healthy exercise to go through, and it kind of reinforces the importance of standards and gives you that external look from colleagues in other states. So I don't know how internal audit shops do that, but that may be certainly something to consider as well, is to have somebody externally come in and assess your protocols and make sure that you can have great protocols, but if you're not following them, that may be a problem as well. So that's just another suggestion.
My final comment, besides the concept of an entrance conference, besides having standards that you follow as an office and the ongoing training that auditors take under these standards, I like. And finally, your comment about making sure it's really an ongoing process, so it's not the hammer at the very end, that you meet periodically throughout the dispensing of the dollars so that you have a better handle of what is going on. Those that are receiving it have a better handle of what's going on, and it's not at the very end where it seems so onerous, or the monies are already expended and you're playing catch-up. You spent them. How? Prove it. I mean, so I like that aspect of it too. So you've really helped frame this issue for me. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Or sure.
Very informative. Thank you very much for being here before us today. A couple of questions. You mentioned that, and we have some of the material here concerning your review of the 6 agencies in the infrastructure program. Was that review on how they met the executive order, and if so, can you elaborate a little bit about the State Allocation Board's responsibilities around that? I heard you talk a little bit about that. And then my second question is around in the audit, in the performance of the audit, part of our responsibilities is an outcome that the voters of California want, a high-quality school. How does that figure into the audit process? Is it part of that, or is it simply the fiscal side of, that we apportioned a dollar got expended? So if you could comment on that as well.
Sure. We did look, when we conducted the audit under our high-risk authority, because we identified infrastructure as an issue area that we really need to continue to focus on over the long term. And the State Allocation Board certainly was one of the 6 entities that we looked at. As I indicated, there's a three parts to the accountability plan that the governor had in his executive order. One was the initial upfront planning. The second was the in-progress. Help me out. Thanks. The in-progress accountability, and then the follow-up accountability. What we concluded is that the requirements that were established in the executive order, we thought if entities followed them, would really provide reasonable assurance that good planning is put in place, there's the in-progress monitoring, and that once a project is completed, there's that follow-up assessment. So we thought the program itself was structured very well. It's kind of in its infancy, so really when we looked at the different agencies, including the State Allocation Board, we were really looking at that first planning phase, because what was required is each of the entities, including the Allocation Board, had to submit plans to the Department of Finance as to how they were going to manage their particular bond programs. And I think there were 7. We have a table in the report that shows about 7 plans that the Allocation Board was required to submit. Those were all submitted. They were all approved by Finance. So as far as the State Allocation Board is concerned, you met the expectations of the initial upfront planning. We didn't do a lot of work as far as in progress because, as I said, much of this is still in the early stages. Some of the bonds actually had some funds allocated, but we didn't see a significant amount of expenditure. So we didn't go into kind of phase 2 and doing some testing of expenditures. But certainly the proper structure has been put in place, and Finance, we think, has a good process for approving those plans. They're required. The plans are required to be posted on the website for transparency. That's happening. Much of the information that the entities are supposed to be reporting to Finance was happening. Some agencies weren't as prompt as they should be. But again, I think our overall assessment in this report is that this is a very good program that's been put together, and if it's implemented properly, which at this point, the initial stage seems to be, it would be a good program. As far as assuring voters that they have good schools, that goes beyond fiscal auditing. That's where the legislature oftentimes asks us to conduct what we call performance audits. That's what they're referred to in the standards, and that's really looking at programs and how efficiently, so how effective are schools in educating students. So that would be an audit that would be different than an audit of bond accountability as far as expenditures.
I'm not talking about program, but I think your answer would. Well, I'll ask you that. Would your answer be the same? I'm talking about the physical building, the infrastructure that we bought, and in the same case of a transportation project, it's a road, a water project. I'm not sure what the outcome would be, but there's an outcome there as well, and that is, did we build, what we said we were going to build?
Sure.
And was the dollar expended for that? That's what I was talking about?
Oh,
not
that's
necessarily
absolutely.
what goes on within those walls, but
Sure.
did the wall?
Oh.
How did it turn out and such?
Absolutely, and the in-progress monitoring of the bond measure, the use of those bond funds. The bond funds were intended to build a bridge. I mean, that's not for a school, but build a certain high school. And that in-progress monitoring is looking at what were the plans for this particular school. If those plans were modified, who approved the modification, who made the decision to modify, who approved it. Did you follow, again, proper protocols and procedures in making alterations to that particular structure? The initial plan said it was going to be 50 classrooms, and now it turns out to be 30. Why was that decision made to reduce it? Were the proper procedures followed? So that's going to happen during in progress, and then the follow-up accountability phase, which is the third phase in the governor's executive order, would be, okay, now the project is complete. Let's go back in and take one more look at all these policies. And we've done the in-progress monitoring, hopefully, and now we're ready to look at kind of the closeout phase of this particular project. And did we, based on all the changes that were made during the process, get ultimately what we intended to get? Maybe it changed a little bit along the way, but we followed proper protocols and procedures during the course of construction, and then that follow-up look at the project would say, yeah, we got what we paid for.
That's very helpful. And then just one follow-up is, do you see any difference in those types of infrastructure projects where the local entity has a substantial local contribution and the state has a portion of it as well? Any difference in how the audit is approached for those types of projects versus those that the state funds in full? And again, I would like transportation, when those funds are provided, the state, is actually running that project. In our instance, the state is providing funding for a project that also has, in most cases, local funding, and the local entity is responsible for the operation of that project. Is there any difference in the approach for that kind of auditing of funds than the other case?
I think as you consider that difference, it could have an impact on your risk assessment and how you would conduct the audit. And in particular, if the local entity had different oversight processes in place, as an auditor looking at the whole, you might come in and evaluate the quality of those processes and whether those reviews, if you will, were happening. And that could end up altering the particular audit procedures you decided you might need to perform, as opposed to, hey, I go in and I know there's no local oversight. It's all on us to make sure a state dollar is spent well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other
Thank you.
questions?
Any other questions? Well, thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. That was very helpful as an overview. Let's move on now to the evolution of the OPSC audit procedures, and also the link. Maybe what we do, we should have both. We're now looking at the actual OPSC audit process, and also we're going to look at the evolution of the link between the local educational agency audit and the OPSC audit process. So maybe we can have both come up to the table, both Letty Boggs and Rob Cook.
Just thinking that in a big issue that just came up there, she was referring to the SAB, and we did not, the SAB never
I'll
showed.
ask. I know that. That's exactly. This is the executive summary of what
Most insightful, Mr. Cook.
Welcome, Mr. Cook.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having us this morning. For the record, Rob Cook, Executive Officer of the State Allocation Board in the Office of Public School Construction. And I have with me members of my staff, Lisa Silverman, Chief of Fiscal Services, Dennis Meal, our audit guru, and Steve Inman, a practitioner field auditor as well. And of course, Letty, if you want to introduce yourself.
I'm Letty Boggs with Colby.
Good.
I'll lay out the evolution, and I will reach back about 2 years altogether for the Office of Public School Construction and its audit program. First of all, with all due deference to Caltrans and so on, I believe that the school facility program is the crown jewel of California's public infrastructure programs. The voters have authorized more than $35 billion worth of bonds over the last decade. The State Allocation Board has approved apportioned more than $28 billion in that time for approximately 9,700 projects. And we've released funding of about $27.5 billion to about 9,300 projects. Our current fiscal issues have slowed us down a little bit, but nevertheless, this program has been exceptionally effective at moving funds out to school districts. And part of that, a key part of our efficiency and effectiveness in moving those funds out to districts are front-end certifications by districts where they sign and document make several attestations in their applications, and our folks on the front end work through and take on face value those certifications, much as certifications that any one of us might make to the IRS or the Franchise Tax Board. Those are taken at face value, but when we come around to the audit time, you will be asked to verify and confirm. And the program itself is, I consider there are 3 hallmarks to this program and that are essential in keeping our faith with the voters. And that is that there's equitable access to the funds and equitable treatment of school districts, that there's integrity and accountability associated with the funds, and that we all deliver the results that the voters expect. Those are, in my opinion, absolutely essential for the ongoing health of the program. Now, in Proposition 1D, in specific, Projects are required by both Proposition 1D language and the Governor's executive order. Project audits are required. Also, in the ballot argument for Proposition 1D, in part said, every dollar must be strictly accounted for on a project-by-project basis with independent state and local audits. That was a ballot argument in favor, signed by 3 entities: the Coalition of Adequate School Housing, the California Teachers Association, and the California Community Colleges Board of Governors. And that is the promise that we made to the voters, and that is the promise that I have the responsibility of upkeeping. Executive order, as Elaine Howell mentioned, Executive Order SO-207 requires agencies to implement accountability measures. And while I'm on that topic, my thanks to Elaine Howell. It's quite obvious why she guides one of the premier audit agencies in the nation. And it was a very useful auditing 101 for many folks in the audience, I'm sure. But that executive order requires us to have front-end accountability, in-progress measures, and then back-end audits. And as Ms. Howell indicated, it applies to all boards and commissions. And that lays out the stage occurring certainly since Proposition 1D was enacted in November of 2006. Subsequent to that, this organization, my organization, engaged in a performance audit on our financial hardship program. There were some issues that were raised by particularly a material inaccuracy in one district and about issues associated with that. We had an independent auditing organization come in and do a performance audit on that program. There were many issues that were raised in that performance audit, some serious inequities that occur in the program. One of the key issues that cropped up, at least from an internal program aspect, was that we had insufficient staff training. And following up on that, the board asked for me to put together a work plan to implement the findings of that performance audit. One of those key recommendations was a very thorough and exhaustive training program for staff in this area, and we've been executing on that. In the execution of the training and program review, we identified many actually serious issues with regards to the program. We had poor practices. We were at that time auditing every project. As Ms. Howell indicated, you don't audit. She doesn't audit every program under the state. You go where there are material issues. We were reviewing 30 to 100% of all expenditures on a project, which again is simply a poor practice. There was no formal training program in place. There were no formal audit procedures, no formal review procedures, no formal audit work papers, no audit scope, limited on-site visits, and no assessment of grantees' internal controls, and no risk-based audit model in place. All of those issues have now been corrected. And further, to comply with our audit responsibilities, the following actions have been taken. Obviously, one of the key ones is we've hired experienced auditors from various entities that have a breadth of experience. And I will tell you today that our audit capability is substantially superior to the one that I took over in June of 2007. We have also developed audit guidelines and commenced field audits, all of which are essential to really improving the quality of our performance. Also, Ms. Howell relayed that every 3 years they're required to go under a performance review by an external entity. We will be undergoing an external review by the Department of Finance this fiscal year, and we look forward to the review of the program under that, and think that's a great practice. A good manager welcomes an audit. You learn a great deal in the execution of an audit. And then I'd like to discuss briefly the benefits of bond accountability. The prior approach is that there would be front-end certifications by districts, and then they would go execute their projects, and at some point after they'd completed the projects or time had elapsed, we would pick up a project for audit or for review, really. A lot of time can elapse in that. Up somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 years can elapse in the time frame on that, and at which point there is no opportunity for anybody to do corrections, improvements, etc. It's all everything is done, everything is closed. What in-progress reviews allow us to do is actually reach out to our customers and allows us to identify issues early, allows them to improve them within while the project is open, and to do mid-course corrections in program compliance and performance, et cetera, which is vastly superior to the prior approach. And anyway, we have begun executing on that, and we are very pleased with the results. The engagements, I think, from our perspective, have been very helpful and much more efficient, frankly. Our old approach could literally drag on for 3 years back and forth with the district. The approaches now are much more efficient for both parties. And, anyway, with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions.
If I may, Mr. Cook, so if I was using BSA's template, what I didn't hear you say is you don't really have an entrance conference or entrance interview where you say to a district, here's what we're going to do, here's what to expect. Do you have one of those or not? What I did hear you say was that you've got procedures in place now. I didn't hear you say you're using any generally accepted government standards. I heard you say you have in-progress audits. I think that was something else that I heard was good. And then I didn't hear you talk about the risk assessment because, again, that becomes why you do the audit. And clearly audits are independent and they're supposed to give the public some sense of accountability. So I'd like to hear you talk about how you meet the suggested protocol, not saying that's the only one, and then a little bit more about your risk assessment, how you pick the audits that you end up doing.
Steve, if you'd like
my name
to
is Steve Inman. I'm an audit supervisor with the OPSC. And I'd like to begin with the question regarding the entrance conference. As part of our training collaboration with the Office of State Audits and Evaluations, we've adopted a entrance conference agenda, which we utilize during our current field audits. And what it does is outlines the scope and objectives of the audit. And we talk about those in detail. We mentioned to the auditee the fact that we will communicate with them, as Elaine Howell alluded to, communication regarding findings or any situations that come up during the audit. We talk about audit strategies. We talk about documents needed. We talk about our internal control assessment. And we also mentioned to the auditee that we will work closely with them to resolve any issues throughout the audit. So after we go through that, we talk about the reporting process, the district's ability to reply or respond to any audit findings that come about. And we also mentioned timeframes for the report to come out. Finally, we talk about logistics of the audit, space to be provided to the auditors, and this type of thing. So in terms of our audit entrance agenda, we follow strict guidelines according to OSEA's model, and we follow the procedures that Elaine Howell alluded to.
Now, is that entrance conference done before your very first in progress, very early on, after the first dollars go out, or is this entrance conference at the end when you're doing the compliance?
Our entrance conference begins the moment we walk into or meet with the auditee at the audit site. What I generally do before we begin that audit agenda, I talk about bond accountability, since it is a related criteria to OPSC criteria. So that affects the scope of our audit.
So you do it before you're first in progress, or do you do it at compliance? That's all I'm trying to figure out.
Right.
Actually,
As a lead into the audit and prior to the audit agenda, we talk about criteria. I try to lead in talking about the overriding criteria during the audit. And bond accountability is not expressly written in OPSC regulations. So I bring that up as subject matter because it's an overriding criteria.
Do you think we should have bond accountability in our regulations?
I think so. Bond accountability is an overriding compliance feature of Proposition 1D.
Can you explain what you mean by bond accountability?
The executive order regarding bond accountability means that the districts that we audit should have appropriate internal controls in place to efficiently carry out the process of construction and also provide adequate reporting for the cost.
And, oh, go ahead.
No, go on.
If I may, Robin, and maybe you can address this, the kind of change from when the executive order came out. In your mind, did we have bond accountability previously in the sense that we were auditing districts, correct? And what is the change that you see from previous, I mean, as you said, $28 billion have been expended, not all of which is under this accountability model, but that has been expended in the past. Have we, we had an audit process for that. How did that go? And then how has this changed? What's the difference in the change?
The deficiencies that I described to you a little bit earlier, we didn't have audits. We had reviews, we had desk reviews, paper reviews, but those were not audits. This program, as we've looked at how we've done business, we have been trying to progress so that we can move towards generally accepted government auditing standards, and that we have real legitimate protocols in place. There were substantial deficiencies in what this program was doing prior to that time.
Well, you always had an audit guide. So are you saying you had an audit guide with no audits?
Well, Dennis, would you like to respond to that one?
Hi. I have about 37 years of audit experience. I retired from the Department of Finance last year, and I was working to try and develop this program. And then they liked me, so they hired me as a retired annuitant. So I was a little shocked when I first got involved in this program because it's one of the biggest buckets of money in state government. And when I found out from staff working with me that, and they brought me back an expenditure report, and the expenditure report had a signature on it. And I said, well, where's the detail? There wasn't any detail. It was a one-page self-certification. Yep, we spent $13 million last year on this project. So I couldn't understand why this program had stayed under the radar for so long. It was absolutely amazing to me. But I want to comment that what they've done, because OSE really has provided beginning training and beginning templates, and we developed an audit guide, a starting audit guide for them. They have made remarkable progress in building an audit organization where none existed before. And when I first was assigned this project, I was told by my chief at OSE, they don't have an audit function, they just do desk reviews. So what we're doing is moving from the desk review stage where you can't determine the validity of any of the numbers to a real audit function where people go out and look for supporting documentation. That's what the 5 million voters who voted for Prop 1D want. They want auditors to make sure the money's being spent on their school building and not going into a slush fund somewhere. So I really commend these folks here. They have done a remarkable job of trying to build an organization. And, you have audit organizations that have been around 30, 40, 50 years. They've made remarkable progress in the 2 years once they started the training and building audit programs.
I want to follow up on those questions, if I might. Sure. Just earlier on, the question was raised about the audits between, Ms. Moore raised, between those districts. She said, do we do the same thing between districts that are, for example, financial hardship or 100% state funded versus when we have really partners out there that are coming up with funding? Do we have different procedures when we're doing all the oversight, all the control, versus those where we have partners out there who are already doing some of this? And how do we deal with non-duplicative kinds of processes in our procedures? Not just asking people to go through the same thing when they too are accountable.
I'll answer that question. Under our current audits that we're performing in the field, these are closeout audits. Okay, they're not financial hardship audits, which are still performed.
No, I was just wondering, in the field, not the front end accountability, but when we're doing the actual in progress audits, when we're going out there, do we have different kinds of procedures to those that when we're fully funding it versus those that where we're not? Or do we have this? Do we ask them the same questions? School district is paying half the money.
What's built into the audit program, as all audit programs, is as part of the planning stage, just like the state auditor said, we look at all audit reports that have already been done. If there's a single audit report, we look at that. Mm-hmm. That may lead us to certain things that, gee, we should test more, or guess what, we don't have to test those areas. We look at the Prop 39 bond reports, if they are available, and we'll see if there's anything there. The whole idea, in order to have a professional audit organization, is you must have the upfront planning processes, and that includes looking at all of the different audits that have been done. Now, for the Prop 39 audits, those are kind of focused on the fund as a whole, and they may not get down to specific transactions. And our audits have to be project by project, specific transactions related to building a SFP funded project. So that avoids that audit duplication. That audit duplication does not exist from any data that I have ever seen. So that's part of that. And in fact, quite frankly, in terms of an audit, it's like painting your house. A lot of the work goes up front before you start painting. Well, a lot of the work on an audit gets done before you go out there and test transactions. You have to do this background work because you're not going to sit there out in the field taking up their time on saying, oh, can I see your audit reports now? You do that up front in the office, and that's part of your planning, and that helps you lay out what you're going to do in the field.
I'd like to add one more thing regarding the planning work, pre-audit work, internal control. We've got a procedure now where we will engage the district or go out prior to the actual substantive testing, looking at the numbers and account balances, general ledgers, these type of things. And we will obtain as much internal control information as we can, for example, the district's single audits, also some of the district's desk guides and internal control policies, procedures that are specific to SFP construction, and study those and begin a preliminary risk assessment prior to going back into the field. That gives auditors time to design their audit tests and develop a full view of the internal controls. It's important that auditors understand internal controls of the district, and it's probably the most challenging part of an audit. It takes the most time. Auditors typically do not understand specific construction programs, these type of things. So it's important for the auditor to gain a full understanding of the district's policies, procedures before they re-engage.
So I'm not sure I got an answer to the question. So you're saying that in the setting of it up, you look at other audits that are done. You in the initial front end audit, you know. But I don't know. Are there differences? Again, when the state is when we are doing audits in which the district is not putting up any money at all, and when this district is our partner putting up half the money in the process, there is no. I'm just asking: is there any difference?
No, there's no.
So there's just as intensive under both. Mm-hmm. That's what we're going to hear later on, and where some of those issues are, and it's important for us just to get this out. The other question that I have, and just understand that, not to saying one is right or wrong, but we're hearing from folks, and so we need to set a context of what some of those issues are, and can we take a good process and make it better. The other issue that I have is, well, it's not an issue, as a relatively new member of the State Allocation Board, I listened to the auditor, and at times she used the terms interchangeable, OPSC and State Allocation Board. I heard at different times, and she went back and forth as though they were the same. I'm just wondering, with this, after the governor's executive order came out and then the OPSC responded to that, was there an approval process of this auditing process or the three-stage by the board itself? Did the board ever deal with this as an action item?
Yeah.
Or did OPSC respond and do it just themselves?
OPSC responded, as I understand. I think that was done about February, March of 2007.
And why didn't the board, do we know, ever deal with this issue?
You're touching on one of those weird governance structure issues that we have with the State Allocation Board and the Office of Public School Construction.
I think it says in the executive order, the governing board.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if anything. It was before I was there. I didn't bring it up. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I just wondered what the role of the governing board was.
Yeah, and all I can assume, because it predates my assumption of my current role. I'm sure it was well vetted with the chair of the board and discussed with members, but I don't know the extent. I can't really comment.
Did it go to the implementation committee?
No.
It might be something the full board might want to look at in the future. I mean, that could be something as
I just didn't understand because I kept hearing it, and then I never saw any action on it. I looked back to see whether the governing board had ever done anything and discussed this, and it hadn't.
Okay, I wasn't aware.
So I know it predates almost all of us, and so I just wondered. Yeah,
well, I was here then, but I don't recall that, and I think that they're indicating it was done internally and provided to the Department of Finance, right, is where they're the approval piece of that. It may, I think, whether the subcommittee wants to look at, well, let's, bring that before the board so that they're properly aware of it as well, because it seems a very cornerstone of what the program is now, is this process, not just, not cornerstone, but it's not, it's new and it's different. And what I'm interested in is also, you talked about an internal audit guide. I think that you've developed and you feel that it has assisted the staff with the ability to conduct an audit. I'll tell you, I believe districts felt that desk reviews were an audit, and I know that districts many times had to produce warrants that proved where expenditures were made. So there was a system occurring at that time. There was an audit guide. Districts, I think, lived and died by that audit guide. and we're utilize that document very thoroughly and very seriously as they work their projects, and perhaps we'll hear more about that from the district's perspective as well. I'm curious on the audit on the district side. Ultimately, the goal of an audit, I think, and the goal of the State Allocation Board is to ensure that the funds are being expended appropriately, and that we've taken the risk analysis that you say. And it's not a gotcha situation. We want people to be well informed, to be well equipped to deal with the funds that we are providing, that the state isn't providing them as part of a project. So in that manner, the more that they know what the process is, as you talked about an entrance exam or entrance model, I don't know when that entrance model happens with the district, but the more, is the audit guide now available for all school districts on their side, not the internal one? And even the internal one, if districts know, well, this is how the state is going to review things, you better have your docs in order. Are they knowledgeable of that? And also, how does it work in an audit that, I enter my project right now, 2009, I got my funding, I'm going, I have an audit guide, I set up my internal controls, my accountability. Lo and behold, 5 years later, the audit guide has changed, and there's different expectations from here. How do we deal with that if that happens? And so those are, what are we doing to give information to those that we're auditing?
Hi, I'm Lisa Silverman, and I'm hopeful I can address your question. For the most part, if we all, I know the executive order and bond accountability is somewhat an understanding and trying to understand the process. I think the goal of bond accountability is to provide outreach to the districts and not have a negative connotation. I think perhaps the way the current program is built on having an audit after the project is built. Mm-hmm. It is a negative impact. It's a negative impact for districts who, they've built their project. And unfortunately, if there's any mechanisms or compliance issues that they could have helped improve during that process of the building of the project, then it would have been more of a kinder, friendlier, gentle approach. And I think if you really embrace bond accountability with the front end and the in-progress process and then the follow-up process, it's going to be less of a burden for the school district, less of a burden for staff, and less of a burden on everybody at the end. So, it's a less negative connotation. Mm-hmm. So, we, as far as trying to adopt procedures and provide more outreach, that is the goal. The goal is to shift to a more of an in-progress front-end review versus, unfortunately, the way the program is designed right now, the results come to you at the end. And that provides negative results for everybody. And we don't necessarily want to be in the I gotcha business. That's not our goal. Our goal is to provide customer service and outreach. So if there's additional mechanisms we can do to provide additional service, that's our goal. We're going to try to establish a pilot project to provide more outreach to those districts who receive funds and provide outreach through every stage of that progress check. So that's our ultimate goal.
I think we all would share that goal. My question was, have we changed the audit guide now? How do districts know about this new process and procedure?
The program really has just started field audits in the last month or two. The program is evolving, it's developing. We've only touched 4 school districts so far. So it's an evolving program, and the audit guide will continue to be refined. And so we're just getting started. That seems like there's a lot of, the sky is falling out there, but we have hardly touched anybody yet. We haven't gone out and touched a lot of school districts. And the reaction that Steve and his crew is getting is pretty positive. They're out there and they're providing, when they do their internal control reviews, providing some advice. One of the things that happens, especially in some of the smaller districts, is they'll have somebody working there for 10 or 12 years. Everything works fine. The person leaves, and guess what? Everything falls apart because things aren't in writing, because there's no procedures, there's no backup person. That's the big thing in a lot of the school districts, and that's why they have problems with financial records. That's why they have problems submitting reports on time, because they have what we call key person dependency. And what we're going to try and do in our pilot project when we get it going, we want to really go out there, especially if it's a district that has limited resources. I want to go out at the application stage. And when they submit their application, I want to go out there and talk to them about, well, now how are you going to handle this check when the check comes in? How are you going to account for your money? What are your procedures in place for payments to the contractors? Yes, okay, so you're going to deal with the inspector of record, and the inspector of record, who is your on-site field inspector, has a sign-off on the form. Good. Now, what kind of procedures do you have in writing so that if you leave the organization 2 weeks from now, somebody will be able to come in and have a desk review manual so they can say, oh, this is my job and this is the kind of things.
I think that is all very something that is exactly what the subcommittee is looking at. But I think from my question that, what do districts know about this process? What is the guidance documents that they can refer to about how we've changed isn't there yet, and yet we've started the program. Good, bad, and different, the program, districts need to know how is the system going to work, and then, then we will adapt to that system. The system that they've had in place now for many, many years there's an audit guide and the process of how we've gone through the process to the end of a project and the closeout of a process. That's been an existing process. If you've pointed out deficiencies in that, then how are we changing that, and how are we communicating that in an audit guide? Every year districts go through audits, and there is a state audit guide, and that's what they follow, and it gets changed in a process type manner. We'll probably hear more about that today. I think it's an important component that we're talking to the districts what the standards are.
I don't really see that the documents that they have to keep track of are any different. The difference is, instead of just hoping there's an invoice out there that truly supported this final closeout, that somebody's going out there to look at those source documents. I think the word source documents is the key to the change. I don't see anything changing in terms of, here's this documents they've had to have. Cash put on a really good training session last February, and it was very positive about the audit function. And it says, okay, here's what they do, here's the records you need to keep, and then they have a big laundry list of records. So I don't...
That's part of the audit guide.
Yeah, it's always, the records they have to keep has always been there in procedures and things. The audit guide is simply, now, here's what I'm gonna go out and look at these documents.
Well, two other questions, and then I think I'll
Move
stop.
on
I could have a lot of questions, but I think we're establishing a process, and it's wonderful that we have everyone here to advise and talk and discuss that. A couple of things that I heard, and I just wanted to confirm. One was that we don't audit everyone. So can you talk a little bit about that, or how that systemically is working? And then I heard that we've gone out to districts. I think you mentioned 4. What part of the process are we going out to districts in? Is that interim part of the process? Is that at the end? And what is that about? And do districts know what that is about? What kind of guidance do they have concerning that?
I'll let Steve handle the field aspect of that. But just as Elaine Howell mentioned, she does not audit everyone within the state, and you do a risk assessment, you focus your resources. She has limited resources, we have limited resources. You focus them on material issues. And
so you're doing risk assessments of districts' capabilities and past performance and prognosis of future performance, and then determining whether they are one that the program needs to audit.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Steve.
Well, I would like to add, in terms of the districts chosen for audit, that they generally come up on a risk or on the workload list as they come into the office. And as you know, we have quite a backlog in the office. So as they sit there, every month, a new, after the prior month's audits are assigned to our auditors, a new group of closeout audits moves to the front at the top of the workload list that have been sitting out there for quite a while, and we take them as they come. We do have a risk assessment model in the office from which they're assigned.
So are you saying that there's perhaps 10 projects on the workload that have said they're at completion and ready to close out? You do a risk assessment as to who you would audit of that 10, and then do the audit of those that were of highest risk. The others simply are accepted and are closed out.
Right. What we're trying to do now, instead of a project by project audit, we are approaching it in terms of the district. Okay, and for example, there may be 15 or 20 projects on the workload list by one district. Mm-hmm. So what we do, and what auditors typically do, is assemble that entire group of closed out projects on the workload list, look at the risk assessment criteria related to those projects, and we will sample. We will not audit every one of those projects. We will take samples within that group of closed out projects and conduct a review of those specific projects. Auditors sample.
A while ago, I asked about your risk assessment criteria. Is there anything more you can tell me that guides you? Because that becomes the threshold for why you're auditing anybody. So I would like to hear a little bit more, if it's possible, about what guides you into picking District A as opposed to District B.
The elements of risk include dollar amounts in aggregate. They could involve, again, dollar amounts. They could involve prior findings, prior audit findings in the office, for example, inaccurate, incomplete reporting. Auditors generally have a myriad of items within their potential risk areas.
Okay, thank you.
That
And
type of thing.
the only other comment, I know we have to move on. The other aspect of auditing is not just accountability, it's independence. And one of the issues that I would like to hear about something coming to us for approval, we're a political body. And I think we got to be very careful about anything we do to touch on what an independent, thorough, and complete audit should include. I think we have the right to talk about scope, talk about what it should entail, talk about protocols, but I'm not certain I want to act on what an audit is. If that happens, I'm going to perhaps ask for some comment about whether OPSC should not be in the audit business. You know, we put the money out the door. Maybe we should have truly an independent audit by Department of Finance or somebody else. I mean, to me, what I heard about audits are not just about accountability. It's about objectivity. It's about independence. And as we go forward, I'm going to want to evaluate a little bit more about whether we're in an interesting conundrum by virtue of having an audit function within OPSC. Maybe we should do it by contract.
Mr. Harvey, I just want to, I know you were looking at me as you were saying that. I just want to be clear that I wasn't talking about our entity looking at, approving of audits. I think I was just responding to that we have presented a plan to the Department of Finance about how we're complying with an executive order. And I do think that that's probably something that a board, I think it said or executive, but I mean, I think the board has a role in that. So I hope you weren't taking it that way.
I wasn't taking it that way. I didn't mean to be looking at you suspiciously. I was just kind of making eye contact throughout.
I wanted to be clear what I was talking about. And, there is the school model that, they are independently audited every year by outside entities. And I'm assuming what you talked about is that's one of the source documents that you review. And I hope there's a lot of education around that because it takes a long time to understand those audit reports as well. Schools, any entity, I think they have their unique functions that occur. So,
let's move on. That was very helpful. Let's see it. Letty, Boggs, any thoughts about what we've been talking about?
Oh, many thoughts, but let me go through my prepared remarks.
Okay.
And I think some of them may serve actually as summary to some of this conversation. And my remarks are really prepared from the district's perspective of what the audit appears to them. There are three critical types of audit for the facilities department. There's the fiscal audit.
Okay.
This is performed by an outside independent auditing company. There's the GeoBond performance audit, and this is reviewed in addition to being reviewed with the district. This is reviewed with the Citizens Oversight Committee. There's the Office of Public School Construction audit, and actually financial hardship districts have a different audit criteria than regular districts as far as approval for projects, and I'm not really dealing with that in my comment, but that is an extended and additional audit. But before we discuss those in more detail, I wanted to talk a bit about the authority structure and the way it functions in a school district, because this is true of all California school districts, and this is something very primary. It's the very first authority structure, very critical, and it seems simple. But what happens is that the governing board approves a budget. They own the budgets. The governing board establishes that, and staff lives within the confines of that budget. So the governing board establishes a budget, and to take money from that budget or add money to that budget, it has to go back to the governing board. And then contracts and purchase orders are issued within the structure of that budget. And then payments are issued within the structure of the contracts and purchase orders. It seems very simple, but that structure allows projects and district business to flow very smoothly, because by the board approving the budgets, and they approve contracts directly as awards, but purchase orders and payments can then flow in a regular course of business because they always function within those already board-approved levels. There is another level, and that is that the state account code structure, we call it SACS. SACS lines out very specific coding structures districts have to live within, and that sets another control limit on that authority structure, because if you move within certain types of categories on the coding, you have to go to board. The structure is critical. By establishing the budget and then working within the tiered structure, the contract and payment process are controlled. They have other controls required in every single school district. One of them is alpha control. Alpha control means that if an auditor walks in the school district and says, I want to see everything you paid to Colby this year, you can go to a drawer marked C, find a Colby folder, and in it is every PO and invoice paid to Colby. That's a traditional structure maintained in that fiscal or business office of every school district, and it is audited annually by the fiscal auditors. The second control is alpha. Every district maintains alpha control, numbering all contracts and purchase orders. Those numbers, access to how you get numbered is controlled. There's a void process. If any one of them isn't used, you have to go through a process. And this is all done to minimize risk that anyone's out there issuing bogus POs or payments on behalf of a school district. When a district accepts money from the school facility program, they accept a third control level, and that's project control. At this point, the state has a right to send an auditor in at any time and say, I want to see everything you've spent on that project. Now that differs from the alpha control because school projects are multi-year and multi-fund. So now you're building a record of everything spent on that project, and districts maintain a record of all warrants, everything they spent. While not formal control systems, there's also the state accounting manual, and that in relation to the SACS coding structure provides another control system in that it's heavily monitored how things are accounted, what you put in what kind of code, and all of that is audited under the regular annual audits of the district. There's also a term called appropriate redundancies, and this is we've talked a lot about workflow and accountability for internal controls. Appropriate redundancies are one of those things. When a district sets up a workflow and looks at how a process is going to occur, there's some things you want to make sure and minimize risk by having them be redundant processes. Sometimes seems real inefficient to our community groups and business people we talk to, but this is public money, it's taxpayer money, and we protect it through these redundancies. For instance, anytime you have a bid process, has to be open, has to be observable, has to have been more than one person at the district involved in that process. Contract issuance, PO issuance, same thing, more than one person in that process. Changes to contracts have to occur under prescribed methodology in a district. Invoice approval and payment process also. Duplicate sets of eyes, multiple people handling it so that they have control that it would take significant collusion to steal money from the district. Those things are all in place in all districts. They're audited under other methodologies in addition to what OPSC does. And so I wanted to go through kind of what happens for the facilities department in the fiscal audit. From the facilities department perspective, the fiscal audit reviews each of the funds, what funding came in, a selected number of warrants from those funds, also targeting risk, high dollars, and those kinds of things. They include a review of the bond criteria and our payments being made per the bond. They look to see that individual projects are being monitored within the overall bond envelope. They look to verify all of those budget things are in place. They also assess whether contracts and POs are being appropriately approved and executed. They pay a particular attention to retention within construction contracts because that's a technical accounting issue of booking that liability. They look at the warrant process and follow warrants through that whole process to make sure there's appropriate approval and controls. They verify that the coding's being used correctly from SACS and the State Account Code Manual. They verify that alpha and the numeric control processes. And after the audit, the district receives comments, and much like our first speaker explained today, they go through a process of responding to comments, and those are reviewed again the next year to see if the comments have been addressed in actual practice. The county office then reviews that fiscal audit. The county office also reviews and establishes a statement of the fiscal health of the district. They review all of the warrants as they're occurring, and a certain number of those are pulled for audit on a regular daily basis. And in most of the counties, and we work with districts in 14 counties in California, the county office audits 100% of the capital facility warrants in most counties in California. So they're pulled for audit. Actual documentation is required. A copy of the invoice is required for review before the warrant will even be issued. There's also the performance audit. Any district with a Prop 39 bond is required to have a performance audit of that bond. It reviews all of the projects as listed. It reviews that they're progressing as promised, and it does a fiscal look at the actual warrants being issued. Now, that's not actually not part of the performance audit. The COC, Citizens Oversight Committee, is tasked with reviewing all of the invoices and payments that happen under the bond and are they appropriate to the bond. The COC also is charged with a visual verification that the work is being performed. And that's that, are we getting a building for our money?
May I just ask for clarification? Because in the background information I read, these Prop 39 committees looked like they were focusing more on monies from local school bonds. And I want to make sure I understand how you're using the term bonds and fiscal review, because, again, our obligation under Prop 1D is to look at the state bonds. So I wanted to make sure when you're going through all these lists of things, you distinguish between what's being looked at for me, if you would.
The performance audit that I'm talking about is looking at the district's Prop 39 bond, their local general obligation bond. The expenditures being made by that bond are also often looked at again by OPSC in their audit. So just so you understand that there's and I will speak to how those kind of end up merging for districts in a minute. The depth and the breadth of those audits may vary greatly district to district. Partly in response to the size of the program, a district building one school has a little bit different task than a district with a $500 million bond program. So it also differs a bit based on the local politics. What kind of issues did the community have as they were looking at and voting for that bond? And so there is a very local control aspect of that Citizens Oversight Committee. There is a project audit. Now, this is the OPSC audit. And historically, it has taken several levels. From a school district perspective, we pretty much determined what the audits were like from observation, from the audits we received as districts, because the audit department historically didn't share with us what their audit criteria were going to be. I don't know what Dennis was exposed to, but I can assure you that districts on every single project submitted the contract for every major contract, such as construction or architecture. They submitted the first invoice, they submitted the last invoice, and they submitted the last warrant, and then they were often asked to submit additional warrants as well. That happened on every single project. It was handled by mail, and it was a desk review, but it was a desk review of real information. While the 5006 is the audit reporting document to OPSC and is a one-page document, every district is required to submit with that a detailed listing of expenditures detailing every single warrant expended on that project that accessed state funds. Then some districts had an additional review. So if things came up in that audit, if there were questions, they were asked to submit additional documenting evidence. Sometimes that was handled by mail. Sometimes there would be a visit, either district coming up here, then auditors going to the district. And in warranted cases, there was a full district audit that people would come out, sit with you, look at your processes. That was historically what districts were used to. They were really focused on whether the expenditures were per OPSC policy for what that particular project was. This audit was conducted on information submitted initially in the 5006 that occurs initially on the first anniversary of the funding by OPSC, and then annually every year thereafter until it's closed, or until it's final. These 5006 documents are sent in every year, but one of the disconnects, and I know Lisa and I have had conversations about this, was people felt like they were being reviewed, and they weren't really being reviewed for appropriateness. And the kind of early review they're talking about now is something that districts did not experience in the past. Districts also submit a project information worksheet, and in the last year or so, this expanded significantly the amount of information districts were reporting to OPSC, and it includes financial data, not just what we've spent, but what we intend to spend. It includes building types, what type of project is it, and it provides a narrative where districts can tell their story of that project. How did it get to be the way it is? Did you have to downsize it for bid? All those kinds of things. There are several challenges facing school districts in the past and present audit experiences. One longstanding challenge is that both SACS at CDE and the Audit Department at OPSC establish criteria for school districts, yet they don't coordinate these requirements. Sometimes this makes it difficult to comply with both, as we must. An example is the inventory rules versus the capitalization rules. These are not well exampled in the state accounting manual. Districts are sometimes confused by what seems to be conflicting advice. This is the most common question we get from school districts when we're helping them set up their processes. The problem even tripped up the Macias Group in one of their reports, as they indicated districts were not conforming to CSEM requirements, when in actuality they were quoting inventory requirements instead of capitalization requirements. In a capital project, districts have to follow the capitalization rules. CDE's SACS office has committed to address this in a future right of the next revision of their manual. But this comes at the request of users, asking them to do this because it's an ongoing problem for years and years, and we finally got their attention this year, and they graciously have agreed to do that, but then they were not funded for a revision this year. Complexity is another challenge, and I just use that by way of example of the inter-district complexities we deal with, or interagency. Complexity is another challenge. This program was envisioned as a simplified grant-and-go program, and it never got to be simple. The concept was that we would do away with the heavily regulatory system of the old LPP program, because districts were contributing 50% or more to the project cost, giving them every incentive to do well with that funding. However, as implemented, it never really became a simple grant. And through the years, it's gotten layered with more regulation and process, not less. The program is complicated. Districts have to commit personnel resources to understanding it and staying current with changes, or they have to hire consultants to do that for them. Either approach uses project resources just to navigate the funding options. The OPSC should internally audit the process to assure these four things. One, that the programs are well explained, that when changes are made to the advisories and guides, districts are notified and a log is maintained, and that log is searchable by date, so that we can always tell what information a district knew when they made their decisions, and that the audit scope fits the program scope. As you can see, districts have lots of audit requirements. They have lots of review. Which pieces are essential for OPSC in particular to be auditing? That audit scope should match that program scope. And the audit documentation requirements should be well communicated and in advance, because a good program sets those up at the beginning. Some examples of unnecessary complexity in the program are savings and interest. They're not well designed from an audit perspective, and I think many at OPSC would agree with that. And some minor adjustments could remove much of the challenge with no compromise to the integrity of the program. We're asked to report interest in a way that no one earns it, thus requiring every district to manipulate those numbers for reporting to OPSC. Why not book it the way it's earned? Savings are audited both in the giving project and the receiving project, thus holding the giving project open until the receiving project is closed. Or some adjustment has been made to accommodate this issue, but why not just assign the savings to the receiving project and audit them there, or assign it to a restricted reserve where it can be spent later based on those criteria. There are other examples, but these two are particularly difficult and add audit complexities. The point of an audit should be not to catch people, as others have stated this morning. It should be to send the message that all should mind their processes throughout the project as they're going to be verified at the end, thus promoting good process and good project management data. To the extent the revised audit process is finding issues in districts, it's as much an indictment of the old OPSC process as to the district processes. OPSC, it would be helpful if they could look to their own communication and be sure that districts are clear in that. For instance, making real incremental verifications so people could know early on in the process if they have an issue, make the correction, and manage the project well. Gotcha at the end is not helpful to anyone, especially because we don't learn from it. Targeted audits that focus on high-risk elements and reveal abuses are helpful in keeping the process honest and spreading the funding appropriately to qualifying districts. Districts support this audit goal. The audit processes that districts are experiencing now have changed with little or no notification. This process they described to you today is brand new. It's really new, and districts don't know it's different. So what used to be the audit level only for districts that had demonstrated issues has recently been the audit level for some districts who've never had an issue. So I know one of the 4 districts they audited is one of our clients, and I got a panicked call. They're coming to see me. I haven't done anything wrong. We've never had a history of a problem. We manage all of our documentation. It was a panic coming from a change in process and a change in implementation of audits that districts were not informed about. Only the people who are very observant of the process are aware that this is changing, and the general knowledge out in the districts I don't think is there. They're not opposed to being audited. They are annoyed with being audited, with being required to produce information that they didn't know they were going to need to track. And they're annoyed when something that has already been the focus of multiple audits is now being audited again. We need to be sure that this goal of focusing audits really happens for districts. And they need to have the option to have explained to them what's going to be required so that they can have documentation that addresses those issues. We're implementing a new process now for districts who've been maintaining documents based on an old process. So we want to be sure there's a transition facilitated for districts so they can meet the new goals. This annoyance isn't because they don't want to be held accountable. It's because they barely have enough staff to do the projects, much less spend time re-auditing things that are already audited. The most common feedback I got from clients and colleagues who knew I was preparing these comments was that they want to do a good job. They just never know what OPSC is going to expect or consider a good job. How can they hit a mark that keeps changing? There's always a risk when we're spending other people's money. Audits are usually designed to focus on risk and reveal weakness and inappropriate activity. Districts can't fully eliminate risk. They're not funded to remove all possibility of all risk, as the state is not funded to do that in their own processes. So systems should focus on incentivizing best practice. Audits are a bit like speeding tickets. They function as a deterrent, but only when the rules are known and understood. Otherwise, they're just punitive, without the broader goal being accomplished. It's our hope that this committee will help in addressing some of these concerns so that districts can focus on doing the very best job they can with the funding without fear of losing the money after they've spent it due to a technicality. Both OPSC and districts can focus on getting the best goals for the money for the students of California. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, Scott?
Thank you so very much. It's always good to hear the local perspective. If you have time at some point, I'd really appreciate you telling me what an ideal audit should be relative to the 1D requirement. This voter-approved requirement that says we're supposed to do a project-by-project review of state bond dollars. Because you talked in terms of some of the obstacles. If you have a way of helping me understand what a better audit would look like, I'd appreciate seeing that from you.
Sure.
So hopefully you can do that, and I would appreciate seeing it. Thank you.
Other comments?
I have one other, Ms. Boggs. Can you, are there areas of overlap that, you talked about the annual fiscal audit, the County Office of Education overview of that audit, the Prop 39 audit, the OPSC audit. Mm-hmm. It would seem to me that we would want to concentrate state dollars and local dollars on areas that aren't covered, or that that are of highest risk. And I'd just be curious your perspective of, are there areas that we over audit and that we could perhaps remove from the system? And the only one I can think of is you cannot do a project without a board-approved contract. That board had to approve that contract. County Office of Education won't release a penny until they see that the board has approved the contract. Do we then, again, at OPSC, review that contract? And if so, are there areas we could remove because it's somebody else is doing it, and areas that aren't being looked at by anybody that we should really be concentrating on?
A lot of the challenge stems from the fact that facility projects are by and large multi-fund and multi-year. Mm-hmm. The state accounting practices are designed for school districts to monitor annualized single-fund accounting. We talk in school districts about having different pots of money. Each of the different funds are maintained very independently and never cross over. Works well when you're getting money to run school. You're getting your money in your general fund to run your school for that year. It's to be spent for that year for those students. But when you come to the facilities realm, you now are combining multiple years of project, multiple funding sources in dollars, and each of those funding sources have a different nexus. So your money that comes from RDA has to be spent per RDA requirements. Your money from the bond has to be spent per the bond. Your money from your developers has to be spent per their criteria, and your money from OPSC spent by its criteria. Mm-hmm. And yet it is one project. And to be managed well, those dollars have to be managed as a whole. Your facility department needs to look at all of that together and manage it as one project. This results in that issue of how come we have expenditures, there's all this overlap of funding, combined funding, and yet we maintain them in separate funds by and large because they have different criteria that we have to meet. So we're doing accounting for projects in a system that isn't designed to do what we're doing. And I think that is one of the difficulties in answering questions like, is there an overlap? Yes, there is an overlap because I'm using money from multiple sources. But that said, the payment aspect of, is it a valid contract? Did the right people sign it to get it paid? Did it get issued by a different accounts payable person than set up the check to start with? Those processes are vetted by both your internal audit and the county. And then OPSC historically has been very focused on many of those very same issues. So that's probably an area where they have focused on a redundancy. There are other aspects of the program that they haven't focused on much at all. This looking at our internal controls, looking at internal processes, some of those processes, that's a completely new thing. Districts are not aware they're going to need to share that with OPSC. That's going to be a surprise to a lot of folks.
Yeah, I want to step back and ask, you ended it with some statements that I just want to address. One is that first districts are trying to do a good job, they want to do a good job, but they never quite know where OPSC is going to consider a good job. The communication, they never know when that process unfolds, what I see as the underlying agendas. Are you saying that there really is a culture in which of lack of trust, where each side is not, where their districts feel like they're going to be, the goal is to find something the matter with them? Is that really what you're also saying? It's not a real clearly defined, this is where we're going, these are the kinds of things, let's work together, let's make sure you do these, we're going to be asking for these as they come up, but that in there, and maybe not now as things change, but historically, that there was a culture in which that districts perceived they were going to try to find something. Mm-hmm. That's really what it is. And because you go back later on, they're going to find what they call technicalities. And that's really been their goal, to do it, not to really work with us. Is that really what you're saying historically has gone on?
That's what it feels like at the district level very often. That, they're, and having done audits and being an accountant, I can understand why
is that
it
real?
may
Even
be
though the districts feel
legitimate.
that doesn't mean that the state is, that may just be the very nature of the business. I'm just wondering, are there ways in which we can work on this? It's not, it may feel that way, but no matter how much the state works to try to be real clear.
To the extent that people don't have clear direction of what is going to be required of them, then that spotlight being focused on them feels very punitive. It feels very much like they're trying to catch us on a technicality, and yet how were we supposed to know those were the rules? That's really solvable, and I am really encouraged by the statements today that they're working on that communication piece, because if it's well explained in advance and people have an opportunity to line up their reporting so they know that they can communicate in a way that's going to be understood and received, then they're going to have a better audit experience. Audit is always a bit scary for a district, particularly, accountants. They're problem solvers. They like to have everything neat and orderly and know that they've answered the whole question. And the audit comes in and it's the big final. It's the test to see if you've done that well. What's really difficult is when you don't know, you have no study guide. You've got no way to prepare or know what's going to be required. I'm not saying they don't have any way. They have had an audit guide for many, many years. The difficulty has been it can be changed, adjusted, and people don't ever know it got changed. And so they're working along. They've been doing this for 10 years and don't know now there's a different process or a different interpretation of something. That's a real issue. I think also that communication could be done in some forms that would help people work better. I think the workshop that Dennis mentioned, I think I was in that workshop, and what we did for our clients is we went through the audit guide and prepared a list of absolutely everything they might ever be asked for. We made it an index, we give them a binder with index tabs and say, here's what you need to track in order to be sure you have every document they may ask you for at the end. It's a very easy process. That kind of checklist format, that heads up at the beginning, here's what to look for and snag all the way through, it would be really helpful.
Okay. Scott.
Just a quick comment. I think the most refreshing thing I've heard is that we can almost bifurcate the discussion. You've done a very, very good job of talking about historical inequities. What we're hearing today is that we are on the threshold of doing something very different. I had been under the impression we might have implemented some of these things. We've only got 4 districts. But what I'm hearing is that there is a new day. And some of the things we're going to do are going to be very consistent with independent, objective, accountable audits, and with the ongoing in-progress audits, with the entrance conferences, I think there will be far greater understanding, and I think suggestions about making sure our audit guide is well published, whether it's on the web or sent to every district. These are things that we can do. And I'm very hopeful that as we continue through this process, we hear about how we should be tweaking the new process, because it is now accountable to Prop 1D, or it should be. We are trying to make it accountable to the executive order. We're trying to make it accountable to all the best practices. So let's focus on tweaking something to make sure it is fair and that it is relevant, but people understand and know what to expect. That, to me, is the most important thing of what we can get out of this.
My understanding of the entrance interview is when they come to do it's an entrance interview of an on-site audit. And that's later than the info needs to be out there. The district has already set up and begin the project by the time you have an entrance interview at an audit. So I just wanted to have that clarified. I noticed when you were talking, I wasn't sure everybody.
When do you do the entrance conference? I mean,
when you have an on-site, you do an entrance interview, and the district's already been accounting for the project at that point.
Well, see, there's a nice suggestion. I think, again, it is about communication. It truly is about communication. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to follow that up about communication and something that Rob had said earlier, that the in progress, and just understand that this is more of an understanding in my, that when we're doing the in progress auditing, the second stage of the accountability process, that there may be some kinds of risk audit that is done. Does that mean that districts do not know at that point all that's going to be asked of them, or the criteria, or is there some? Is everything being shared with districts before that process unfolds when you're doing a risk audit? I don't understand that process, is really what I'm saying, and it may just be my lack of understanding. Are you going to be asking for things that they don't know that you're going to be asking for?
I would like to respond to that question. Prior to engaging a district or performing the audit, even going out on the internal control pre-visit with the district receives a letter of requested documents that we'll be looking at. The auditor in charge will also maintain continual contact with that district, identifying all the documents that are required to support the items we're looking at. This is not much different than what's been going on over the last 11 years under the current or former desk audit process.
So there are no surprises.
But if you have documents, you're already working. They need to know before they begin generating documents, what is it they're going to need to maintain.
Well, and I think, may I? Sorry. And then that's the goal. The goal is to establish more outreach, and the goal is to shift the program to obviously be in compliance with the executive order. But the goal is to give out more outreach. And obviously, I hear what you're saying as far as a checklist and establishing checklist, because those are all good tools. And so our goal is to work on this and provide more front-end outreach and not be in a negative.
It's not a goal. I think it is a requirement, and I think what we're going to want to see is some kind of a work plan that gives us some comfort that this thing is underway and a way of communicating to districts the new process. I think a lot of the angst, a lot of the concern, a lot of the, oh my God, a lot of the duplication, I think clarity and communication and being upfront is so very vital. So thank you. But do a work plan. Just don't make it a goal.
And we'll work on that.
Thank you all. Let's move on now to the Arlene Matsura, the audit guide. I thought it would be about 12, 12:30, but that's 4. I think it's been very
Who's coming up?
And then let's just, before we begin, let's just talk about what our time constraints are. About how much time would you think? 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Okay, let's just do that. And then I want to go right to public comment at 12 o'clock and try to finish up, I think, by 12:30, I think, and then maybe have a discussion. I know that Scott has to leave.
I'm open.
Okay, so let's just see. Let's just try to move along.
Good morning. I'm Arlene Matsura. I'm a fiscal services consultant with the California Department of Education, and I am the department's representative on the State Audit Guide Committee. And I'm here today to discuss the process that we use to develop the State Audit Guide.
And how that might help us also in our understanding. Right.
Okay. Districts, county offices, and charters submit annual financial and compliance audit guides. These audits are conducted by independent CPAs, and the CPAs have to be on a state controller's office list of approved auditors to perform these audits. The audit reports have three components to it: a financial statement, a federal compliance, and a state compliance. We developed the state compliance portion, and the process for developing the state audit guide changed in 2002-03. There's always been a committee that determines what procedures go into the audit guide. Prior to 2002, the state controller's office issued the audit guide. And in 2002, there was some audit reform legislation and a new state agency called the Education Audit Appeals Panel. They are now in charge of developing they approve regulations, and the audit guide is in a regulatory format. The Education Audit Appeals Panel consists of a member from Department of Finance, Department of Education, and the Executive Officer of FCMAT, the Fiscal Crisis Management and Assistance Team. And the E adopts regulations, and they also hear appeals of audit findings from LEAs. So the process that is used is a committee will meet, and the committee consists of a representative from the State Controller's Office, from the Department of Finance, from the Department of Education, the California School Boards Association, the California Association of School Business Officials, the California County Superintendent's Educational Services Association, California Teachers Association, and California Society of CPAs. We start meeting now, between now and December, and the end of December, to develop the 10-11 audit guide. So the idea is that the 10-11 audit guide is in place prior to July 1st, 2010. We meet and we add, delete, amend the procedures that are currently in the audit guide. We consider new legislations, new regulations, and oftentimes we rotate some of the procedures that are in there. There's about 20 to 30 state compliance areas that we audit. We might leave one in for 3 or 4 years and then take it out and put something else in. The state controllers is actually the entity that decides what finally goes in and gets submitted to EAP. And then EAP goes through the regulatory process to adopt it. So then it's put out for public comment before it actually gets adopted. And then the new, usually there aren't a whole lot of problems and a lot of things going into public comments because we've pretty much worked everything out prior to that. And once the audit guide is in place, the auditors follow that, and if there is an audit finding, there is a process for appealing those audit findings. Those go back to EAP, and they could appeal those for because they believe they were in substantial compliance, or they believe there was an error of fact, or that there was an interpretation of law problem. And then the EAP panel will hear those appeals and make a final decision. We did have, back in 04-05, that was in the audit guide for 4 years, audit procedures on school district bonds and the state school facility funds. So that was some procedures for auditing the expenditures on that was part of the audit guide for between 04-05 and 07-08. And then that came out as part of the rotation process.
Can you speak a little bit about the rotation process? So are there different aspects that get emphasized during different auditing years?
Well, it just kind of what comes up. I believe in 0405, Department of Finance suggested that the bonds and the school facility funds get audited because there was a problem with the districts, some big problems with one of the district's bonds at that time. And so they suggested that they put it in. So we put it in. There weren't a lot of audit findings in this area. And then it came out, and then other programs, new programs might go in. We try to keep the state the state procedures kind of at a zero-sum game. So if we add procedures, we take others out because it costs the district money to pay for these audits. And so we try not to keep increasing it.
Yeah, I'd like to follow. So what I hear you saying is that the CDE Audit Guide Committee there's a vetting process, final approval by the Audit Appeals Committee. So there's this very public process that takes place where what we have, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, I'm just trying to understand more, is that the OPSC audit guidelines are done internally. They're not reviewed or approved by any board, by the SAB, or vetted by the public. They're an internal process. Do you see that as a problem?
Well, I think they're different. One of the reasons that the state audit, I think, has to be more open is they're performed by independent auditors. And there's some flaws to that, too, because a lot of the independent auditors don't really have the depth of knowledge that would be necessary to do effective audits that sometimes an internal process would have. The internal auditors.
So there are benefits to
there
both.
Are benefits,
because I'm just trying to understand
disadvantages.
if we're going through this, what is the, and there are actually also the utilization of resources too. How expensive is it to do an open vetting process and all? And I understand all that. I'm just trying to understand what is the pros and cons of you're presenting to us a very different process than what we have.
Well, I think that the annual process, it is a good process in that everybody knows what they're going to be audited.
Well, that's what
Right.
gets back to Mr. Harvey's question. The clarity, the more everybody knows what the rules are, what the criteria are, what the guidelines are, the better we are. Then we're really working with people, and the less we know that, and so I'm just wondering, well, here are the different processes. One, which is in clarifying that, is a very open, vetted process. Now, obviously, it deals with other issues and this other one is a process that is done internally that's not reviewed. And so I'm just wondering what the benefits are of both.
I think, though, when it's done by independent auditors, there's hundreds of independent auditors out there auditing. You may not get the quality of audits, or it's at a much higher level.
Independent auditors are at a higher level.
I think are at a higher level. Like 1,100 districts out there, and we had procedures for school district bonds and school facility funds, and they were supposed to sample expenditures and test to see if they met the requirements. And there were 0 findings in 0405, 0 findings in 0506, 4 findings in 67, and 5 findings in 78. And I'm thinking it's because it's so high level that there aren't more findings in this area. So it's really just, it's out there. It's kind of letting districts know that there is requirements, but you're not necessarily going to catch a lot of the errors that perhaps an internal process would be better at catching.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Ms. Massaro, did this process develop over time, or is it legislated?
It's all legislated, but it did develop over time. So there was a lot of problems prior to 2002. There were lawsuits and, dissatisfaction by school districts that the state audit guide had underground regulations and that there were procedures in there that they were being audited for that they didn't feel were supported in law. And that's why we went to this regulatory process. So everything that is in the audit guide has gone through the administrative law, the Office of Administrative Law for
the regulatory
the
side of it.
regulatory process.
Is the composition of the audit committee, I think that you talked about, is that also prescribed in law?
That is prescribed in law.
That was a prescription in law. and then the appeals panel, all of that was
That's all part
prescribed,
of
it's
statutes.
prescribed in law, and then you have it in regulation, and then you annually update it, and everybody knows that timeline, so that it's all, I'm assuming it's all in place come the period of time that districts are going out and contracting with independent auditors to do their annual work.
It's in place several months before, so they know before the start of the idea is before the start of the fiscal year, you know what you're going to be audited for, so the districts could make sure they're in compliance. And then the auditors start going out probably maybe March, April of the following year to start auditing.
I think it's an interesting process that we might consider. I think the added complexity for us, as Ms. Boggs talked about it, is this multi-year, multi-funds. And in that I guess, arena, it becomes more complex in the changes that occur annually. Because when somebody started a multi-year, multi-funded project in 1 year and things start to change over time, that adds to complexity. Not to say that it shouldn't or it should, but I think we need to be very careful of that. And you know, maybe it's something we look at in terms of it's a 3-year process. So for 3 years, it's locked in. This is how it's going to occur. You know, everybody knows the groundwork unless some law changes, which they do, that we have to incorporate over time. I don't know. It's those kinds of things we could possibly consider. But it's a
Scott.
On that question of the statute, can you give me the public policy reason, if you know it, for why the controller was charged with developing the actual plan in consultation with finance and Department of Ed? I mean, as I read the statute, it looks like the controller is doing this, the controller is reporting. Right. Yes, the guide that he develops or she develops must be submitted to the Educational Audits Appeal Panel, but it's for review and possible amendment. Right. When it's all said and done, it's really the controller's document. Can you give me a reason for why?
Well, yeah.
I think BSA should have had it, for heaven's sakes.
Well, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what was all involved back then, but the controller is also responsible for the quality control of the auditors. So they actually can do quality control on auditors, and that could determine whether or not they remain on the list. They're also in charge of the quality control of the audit reports. So the audit reports come in, they get submitted to our CDE and the State Controller's Office, and the State Controller Office reviews the reports and accepts them or rejects them. And if it's rejected, the auditor has to correct it until the SCO accepts it.
Okay, and then
yeah.
And then another distinction, this seems to be a more global audit. You talked in terms of not being very deep. I guess another distinction is the one mandate we have is to do a project-by-project accounting for the dollars. Mm-hmm. Here it's at a much higher level. In fact, you said some of the audit findings were so few, perhaps because you weren't getting very deep.
Exactly. That's what I believe. And the auditors, you know, they bid to get the contract with the district. And, you know, a lot of times it's awarded to the lowest bid. So they're working on a budget too. So I don't know how detailed it. I mean, it says that on the bond procedures, they were supposed to verify expenditures to see if the expenditures were authorized in the official statements and the statements or the bond indenture. So, you know, the auditor would have to actually look at the official statement and bond indenture to see what's eligible. And I don't know how deep they get in doing those processes.
And again, the charge, as I read 14501, goes to sufficiency of textbooks or instructional materials, teacher misassignments.
Those are, yes, there's all those,
again,
all those areas
it's
in there.
almost a different tone and texture, but the thing that is appealing is that people know up front. And it's this whole thing again about understanding and appreciating what is going to be audited and the data that's required so that you're not surprised at the back end.
Right. And then if there is a finding that they disagree with, there is an appeal process that they can go through to state their case.
I think everyone should go to Senator Lowenthal. He's eminently fair.
Here's a probably really outlier question and thought process, but all other district funds are handled the auditing is handled in this annual audit. Is there anything that's audited outside of the annual audit besides capital outlay? That you're aware?
There could be special audits that are called for. I mean, the state controllers, I believe there's authority for the state controllers to build upon audits if they find something that they think needs more research. I think there's also an ed code where a county office could call for a special audit if they suspect fraud or mismanagement.
So all other district funds are handled in the annual audit in terms of the audit law and responsibilities. And I'm wondering if there's any room or way that we can consolidate so that we're not asking districts the same thing, or it may not even be in the. From what I'm hearing you say, it's not going. That high level isn't going to be in the annual audit guidelines, or isn't there right now. But is there a reason that the capital funds do not get the guidance and auditing done with everything else? And is there a way, or are we just, by law, we really have to do this in other audit, not other, but we have to do the audit of the state allocation board funds when all other education funds are done in this audit?
Well,
I don't know. You probably can't
sure.
answer it.
Yeah, I can't.
But I think it's something, again, that maybe we as a board or a subcommittee look at that. And if it's something that can't even be considered, but I'm wondering if that's a better expenditure of taxpayer dollars in terms of the audit requirements that get met and that the program integrity and program transparency occurs.
Well, I know one thing is that the annual audits, the scope is July 1st to June 30th. And I know your bonds or some of your things go through, they cross fiscal years.
Yeah.
Right.
So it may not be possible.
Good. Lots to think about. Thank you so much. Now, let's hear from the public. Want to come up, say some things? We'll have the microphone open. Let's try to keep it. Doesn't have to be. But you've heard now what's gone on. Come on up, have a seat. Are there others that wish to address us also, or is this going to be the group? Okay, let's begin. Introduce yourselves and.
Good morning, my name is Peggy, and I'm here with Long Beach Unified School District. Peggy Williams.
Hello, Peggy.
First of all, I'd like to start by saying how excited we are for this forum to occur, and today's dialogue has been extremely informative. We've heard a number of issues that I think all districts share relative to the complexity of not only the funding process, but the audit process as well. A couple of the things that I haven't heard spoken of this morning are really the nexus between the funding application and approval process and the audit process. These applications that districts prepare, we've heard a little bit today about the time frame that lapses between the final funding apportionment and the audit process, and oftentimes the conclusion of that audit can be years later. But all of that footwork is beginning at the preliminary stages of project planning, which in some cases can occur 2 to 4 years before the application for funding is actually submitted. Those applications are obviously not done in a vacuum. There's a tremendous amount of dialogue that occurs between the district, the Department of Education, and the OPSC. There's often dialogue between the agencies and the district relative to items and components, and specifically in very complex projects that don't really fit necessarily the cookie-cutter model of a typical new construction or modernization project. Oftentimes, those nuances and complexities are discussed in detail with the representation from CDE as well as the project management staff from OPSC. So in terms of the nexus between that occurring and project eligibility being proven and determined and the project application being approved for funding, and then the years that transpire between that occurring and the audit, Oftentimes not a nexus between the project management staff that truly understands the nuances of those decisions that were made and the audit team that's ultimately reviewing the final project expenditures. There's been discussion relative to the project documentation and the types of things that districts need to be aware of up front. But in addition to that, the criteria with which those applications and project expenditures are being reviewed is very important. So we'd like to perhaps suggest that is maybe addressed in future discussions relative to perhaps a project supervisor or a program specialist be involved in the audit with the audit team that really understands those complexities of specific projects and the complexities of the actual program. The second issue...
So, as I understand, so there were lots of discussions that will take place at the front end in terms of the project management staff and the district and CDE or whatever, from understanding the complexity of what is going on. Project then unfolds, and then the application is sent in, project's approved, and then you have an audit down the road starting, which may not have any relationship, the nexus between all the complexity and all those other issues, and the staff. It's just a different group of people not aware of that or not really tuned in. So your suggestion is that there be better continuity or that nexus between that really the management staff who were helping to design the project and work with you and the ultimate audit of this project, whether it met those goals. And it's not just the lack of communication, it's the lack of understanding, too, between what was really intended, those folks that worked, and those people that are now evaluating the project. Is that?
That's absolutely correct. And with that,
That's a good point.
Coupled with the evolution, this has been an ever-changing program, and the evolution of the SFP program has significant bearing as to whether your project in audit is really being evaluated under the same criteria that was in place at the time the project approval took place.
Right.
May I ask a follow-up question? I heard Dennis say that we're going to have a pilot project where the audit team will be literally there at the pre-application time frame. Would you like to volunteer as the pilot?
I think that's something the district would be willing to consider.
I wish you would, because it sounds to me like we are going a long way to remedy that situation, and that's why I'm hoping we can continue to talk about that which we are going to do prospectively, not talking about the issues that plagued us in the past, because I think Dennis candidly admitted we weren't doing audits. We were failing miserably. And part of the problem, as I am putting it together today, is that because we weren't doing audits, and now we are, there's been a real shock. And what we have failed to do adequately, apparently, is to make sure people are aware of why we're doing it, what to expect, and that very necessary front-end communication. But it sounds to me like our pilot may very much address that missing link. So I, in good faith, say, if you'd like to be part of the pilot, let's go for it.
Thank you. Also, speaking to the issue of the time frame involved, again, if the changes that have occurred in the program, you almost need a very elaborate matrix to track how those changes affect a particular project that was perhaps approved many years ago. And then also, with respect to moving through the audit process, I think, as Rob Cook stated, it could be 6 to 8 years from end to end where you're getting through that process. Changes not only in agency staff but in district staff tremendously hinder that process. I think Letty Boggs did a great job in really defining the level of scrutiny and the number and different types of audits that districts undergo. So with that replication she spoke of is very critical in terms of the fiscal side of the house and what documents they retain and maintain versus those of the facilities department. So, document retrieval is certainly an issue, but I think the maintenance and retaining of the eligibility for the project components is every bit as significant in the audit process as it is the difficulties relative to document retrieval and follow through when years and years have gone by. I think that the district is extraordinarily supportive of the audit in general process, not only for state bond dollars, but for our local bond dollars. But we certainly believe that there needs to be specific timeframes that are actually adhered to for the audit completion. There's consistency with the documentation required. Those issues have been spoken to already. I won't belabor them. As well as the audits being conducted in conjunction with analysis of the program requirements at the time. Thank you.
Again, my newness to all this, what you're saying is that this can drag on for years, is that, and...
Yes, it can. Typically, in a very complex project, it certainly could be many years prior to the audit being concluded.
Thank you. Next witness. Next public
Senator
comment.
Lowenthal and
Yes.
Committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. My name is Dave Dumey. I am recently retired Deputy Superintendent for a large school district in Southern California. Have served as the past chair for the Coalition for Adequate School Housing and served 8 years as a member of the State Allocation Board Implementation Committee as we went through and developed the regulations for SB 50. In my 24 years serving in public schools, first as a classroom teacher, teaching physical education and science, and then in my several roles as an administrator, serving 50,000 students, our charge first and foremost is what do we do best and how do we serve our students. When I became chair for CASH, one of the important components that became an element at that time was Senate Bill 50 and a transition in the state school building program. In my 24-year career, I was a part of 30 new schools that were constructed. We built all those schools using local state funds, using local monies matched with state bond funds. We also were successful in passing a local bond measure by a 72% vote approval. What's important about that is as we look at informing our community and keeping abreast of the issues related to audits, our district, despite the fact it didn't need to have a Citizens Oversight Committee, the board felt it was essential to have one. We established one, and not only did we inform our community about what we were doing with our local bond funds, but also our state bond funds. So it was essential they knew what was going on with both pots of money. I'm also proud to say that the Capistrano Unified School District is in the best practices manual for the Office of Public School Construction, as was required under Senate Bill 50. Many of the things that we did in the past, as I think Ms. Boggs described, there are so many requirements that school districts have to go through in audit, and they should. From that perspective, I just wanted to state that there are, it's important that we're not repeating or adding layers of accounting or accountability on school districts when certain audit processes are already there. I'm shocked to say that I worked for 24 years as a school district and learned today that we never had an audit with OPSC. I'm shocked. We submitted, in those days, SAB 184 forms, and those expenditure reports were reviewed. They were monitored. There was discussions between the district and OPSC staff. At the end of 30 projects, we never had a conflict with the Office of Public School Construction. In fact, many times the district would coordinate with the Office of Public School Construction and did so in a very collaborative way. And we found through the audit process that each party at certain times on certain projects owed each other money. So if the district was in a position that it owed the state funds because it had an expenditure that for some reason was not eligible under the guidelines of OPSC, we wrote a check at the end of the project when we had our final closeout. But there were also times when the state wrote our district a check as well. The process worked. I also found it interesting and would like to make a comment that there was a statement made earlier, and in these public testimonies it's important to clarify issues. I don't know of any school district that has a slush fund. It's important to note that when we build capital outlay projects, and we have restricted money for those projects, those dollars are earmarked for capital outlay and capital outlay only. So when an auditor makes a statement that there are slush funds out there, it raises my concern about what is the real meaning of the audit. It needs to be a collaborative process. It needs to be an in-depth process that really reviews that dollars were spent wisely, dollars were spent well, and the schools were built. One last comment, and it relates to managing the program, planning. As a school district official, I made sure that I invited Mr. Bruce Hancock when he worked in the Office of Public School Construction and even at the State Allocation Board level, or Mr. Ted Dutton, or others at the state level, to come down to my school district and see firsthand where the school site was needed, how the school site was going to be funded, introduce them to the developers who were going to participate with 50% matching funds because of Melrose Community Facilities District bonds. The process was open, the process was transparent, and they knew before we did put one shovel in the ground where we were going and what we were doing, and we followed the rules and regulations. I can say successfully those 30 projects have been closed out with OPSC, and there have really never been any issues between the district and OPSC in its accounting or how the projects were constructed. Be happy to address any questions you may have.
Well, I say congratulations. I think you probably are an example of a district that would never have gotten through the risk management filter, because you did have best practices and you did have those accountable standards and procedures which allowed you to spend the dollars properly. And I think I agree with you. The term slush fund is probably an inappropriate term. But to me, another new element of what we're doing, again driven by law, is making sure the savings. Now, there are certain capital improvement projects that end up with some savings, and the statute says you can spend those dollars on appropriate educational activities or facilities, whatever it is. And I think getting to look at those may be something new for school districts. But it is all part of the accountability issue of, if you're spending the money properly and you know up front what kind of questions we're going to ask, then even those dollars will be audited easily and quickly. And it's not a slush fund, but it's money that's not going to that specific project. You have the right to put it someplace else. So to me, the audit of the savings, not the slush, the savings is probably something we can do a far better job of talking about and explaining and making sure people up front know why we're doing it.
I appreciate your clarification from slush fund to savings.
That's my clarification.
Thank you. But the important part is that even in savings, there are very few, if any, school districts that have enough capital outlay that the savings that is identified, as again Ms. Boggs suggested, those monies can be put into a restricted account. They can then be applied to another project that is another capital outlay project. And I believe, well, I know I can only speak for myself, that's exactly what we did.
A movie line said it well: just show me the money. Just track it.
Next.
Good afternoon, members of the subcommittee. Eric Bloom, Director of Facilities Program Management at Los Angeles Unified School District. I had a number of points, but many of them have been made earlier. I will say that we are one of the districts which is currently underway with an audit. We're engaged with OPSC in a savings audit at this time. And briefly, I will say that the audit's still in progress. Auditors were with us for 2 weeks, and they'll be coming back on August 24th and the beginning of that week. Overall, the audit is going well. We're providing the auditors and fully working with them to provide them everything they've asked for. A couple outstanding items we still owe them. I'd say from a standpoint of working with them, we're fully engaged, and I think we've both learned something from each other in the process. I would say that as a reflection in general, this actually savings audit has been ongoing for a period of time before the site visit several weeks ago, is that I think there has been a lack of clarity about what are the requirements of a savings audit and what actually is required in terms of documentation, or what the scope of the audit is actually going to be. So a couple of thoughts for your consideration. Again, generally, it's been mentioned many times today, what is the role of the auditor, of the OPSC auditor, given that we have a lot of other audits that are performed on the school district as well as on the bond programs. Also, what type of audit is really being performed? Are we talking about performance audits? Are we talking about detailed expenditure audits? Something in between? I think those things have been covered, and it would ask for clarification on that as we move forward in the audit process. One point that has been mentioned by several folks is how does this move forward? If there is a new process going forward here, how does that affect projects that were existed and brought forward in a prior domain, in a prior set of rules? And should those projects be subject to the same kind of new regulations or new guidance or new approach to auditing that is being promulgated as we speak in an ongoing approach versus projects, again, that may have been contracts awarded in 2002 or 2003 or even prior. One important consideration I'd like to offer is directly related to savings and savings audit and the interest earned on state funds while those funds are in the county coffers or in the school district coffers, if you will. And to that end, I've provided each of you a 4-page brief, pictorial setup here that illustrates what we're doing today, how the process today calls for in terms of state savings. And today, as you can see in this page 1, it's the requirements as we understand them today are that there's a direct relationship required between a product that had savings on it, a savings generator, and a savings receiver, and that you might have a situation where you have a generator providing savings to more than one project that is using those savings. And so there's this direct relationship required, and it's actually come up as part of the audit that, gee, how do I know that this particular project gave money to that particular project? And the question that's arisen in our minds at the district in terms of going through this with the auditors and looking to answer that is there a way that's just as accountable but a simpler way to audit, frankly, and a simpler way to administer for the school districts? And so on page 2, you see an alternative which does appear to be a simpler way to do things, but it still is ultimately accountable, in that the savings generators, essentially, once savings is declared and agreed upon by both parties, those go into a savings pool. And from that point, you run over, and when those savings are required on the savings receivers, then you report, here's how we've spent those savings. So essentially, you don't have this direct linkage between a receiver and a generator, but you still have ultimate accountability that savings generated is either in the bucket here, in the pool, or it's on a receiver somewhere.
I like the simplicity, but if I want to be critical, it looks like a slush fund. You can't track. I mean, again, it gets down to this definition of what do we mean by a project audit. And I can see, as complex and as colorful as your page 1 is, it does do that. And if we can find that your second page meets that test, hip, hip, hooray. But to me, it does blend the money, and you lose the accountability of it from the generator to the receiver. I'm not saying, again, it's not impossible, but I had to use the line since it was used earlier.
And I understand your point. I guess I would submit to you, again, as a large district with a large building program, that I think any district that has a large building program with a lot of projects on it fundamentally runs into the issue of when there are savings, how do you use those savings? And you may not be using those savings immediately, right? So again, going back to Letty Boggs' comment about the window is open for both projects until all the savings is spent. The bottom line is you may not be using that savings immediately because you have other funding sources, and the savings are going to now augment projects in the future. And so it becomes for any district that has a significant program in terms of volume of projects, number of projects, it becomes a real challenge under the current model. To move just briefly and talk about the interest side of the equation, I guess first question is we're still trying to understand and grapple with what is interest earned in the county fund, in the county SFP fund. Is that interest really savings if it's on a savings project, or is it interest that is earned on cash that's been dispersed, and therefore can it be used for any purpose consistent with that fund? And that's important because interest is earned at a fund level. In our county Office of Education and our county treasury, and I believe in most other school districts that I've spoken with, interest is fundamentally earned at a fund level. It is not earned at a project level. And so the current approach has the interest being earned and reported at a fund level by the county, and then the requirements being now I have to disperse out that interest via some methodology that each school district can choose their own. I think at this point there's not a clear guidance on that. It has to be dispersed out to here's how much interest I'm attributing to these projects, and in particular projects, if they're generating savings, then that becomes part of the savings, and then you now report out this combination of any principal savings, if you will, and any interest savings, and how that now disperses out to projects that could use those dollars. So again, per Lady Boggs' previous comments to the effect, why not just look at interest as it's earned at the fund level, and it gets dispersed out to projects based on being earned at the fund level. And again, part of that is clarifying what is interest. Is it fundamentally revenue and part of, should be recognized as part of savings, or is it kind of a separate entity? So those are, the gist of my comments. I would say in closing that being involved in audit right now, we are fully supportive of transparency and accountability. We're working closely with the auditors to provide whatever they need, and look forward to getting through that process, obviously, and moving on. Our goal is, frankly, to ensure that all of the funds in our program, local bond funds, developer fees, state bonds, other grants, that all of it's spent appropriate to the requirements of that particular fund source. And so state funds are really no different to us in terms of our accountability to our Bond Oversight Committee and our Board of Education. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that, if you look at this issue about how we deal with savings and how we account for savings and what's the best way, the ordinance, the issue, the legislature itself is very general in that it does just say it shall go into, shall be retained by the district and a county fund for expenditure by the district for other high priority capital outlay projects. And the question is, how specific do you need to get? How much of a linkage do you? I think that's something that we can be looking at, because no matter what you call it, we also have to follow, again, we want to provide as much flexibility to districts as the law meant. We're not here to do, as we pointed out, the gotcha thing. But we are here to make sure that there is accountability and responsibility. So that's why it's so important to have models like you've put up, and maybe we can ensure both the needs of both the district in terms of having that ability to move it for any capital outlay project, and the ability to make sure that that money is tracked also. And so however we do that, and I think it will be worthy of discussion by this subcommittee, and I look forward to that discussion.
Senator, I am the DGS director for the week.
You are.
And I've been buzzed to attend a rather important meeting. I'm going to have to leave. I'm very, very sorry. I look forward to continued meetings, because I think what we're doing is an important function. I do hope that one of the earlier things I said we take a look at, which is whether or not we should retain the audit function within OPSC as a body, or whether we should talk in terms of contracting out, given that it's supposed to be independent and objective. So at some point, I'm not saying we do it today.
No, I think what we need to do, that's a very good point, is to decide, and maybe we can just stop for a second and then get back, how we're going to proceed as a subcommittee. I think if the staff would just write up some of these key issues that we have, and then maybe we will meet as a subcommittee just to kind of flesh out what are some of the key issues that need to be addressed with, and then we can see where we go from there. Because what you've done is just, again, say, hey, I want to look at this issue, and there may be other issues. Absolutely. I think that's really where we should, and maybe hold off our discussion as a subcommittee today until we meet again and have an outline of what are the key issues that we think we need to address.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you all for participating today. I do appreciate it.
Senator Lowenthal and Mr. Harvey, did you get a copy of the letter that? Oh, thank you.
I have not. It's coming.
Okay.
It's coming, Laura. It's coming right now.
Wonderful. I will read it. I will read every word.
Thank you, and I apologize for the musical accompaniment to Mr. Doomey's testimony. In our discussions with a couple of state agencies about the audits, there has almost been a Senator Joe McCarthy-like response that the question was anti-American. And Cash is fully, and Tom Duffy for Cash is fully in support of audits, Mr. Dumey and I both at the local level worked with auditors and relish the ability to learn what we may not be doing right in terms of whether it's accounting or identifying both federal, state, and local resources in appropriate categories. So we're fully in support.
You're not anti-audit?
No, we're not anti-audit.
All right.
And you have
check that out. Just want to make sure.
And just to review briefly, at the local level, not only do you have the local audit, which indeed reviews the general fund of the district, the deferred maintenance fund, when that exists in full again, and also capital funds. The auditor may look at food service or any other area that they choose to. The district does not direct the auditor. The auditor comes in and decides what to do. Typically, districts will hire an auditor for a period of years. They get used to the district, but districts will change auditors after a number of years just because people sometimes miss things, and that's a good practice. An auditor is not selected by low bid. I just wanted to clarify that because the comment was made earlier. Yeah, that's a professional contract, and so you may solicit bids and services, but you can choose whoever you think the best is, just like with an architect or an engineer. The Citizens Oversight Committee was established with Prop 39. That's been discussed. Cash at this table back in 2000 admonished the Senate Education Committee to include that in the statutes that accompanied Prop 39, which was, of course, a change in the Constitution. Cash, following that, produced a Prop 39 guidebook, which included a chapter on citizen oversight committees and how they should be approached. So, again, all in favor of let's be real clear and real public with what we're doing. We're spending public money. And I would maybe answer the question a little differently about what does the Oversight Committee look at. The Oversight Committees typically will not see any margins on funds. They would want to know, what are you doing with the local funds? How much did you get in matching share? By the way, can I ask you about deferred maintenance? What about developer fees? And is there anything that you're getting from the redevelopment agency? So although the code is very brief in how it outlines the responsibilities of an oversight committee, as you know, Senator, and as you know, Ms. Moore, working at the local level, you on a council and you with a school district or a couple of districts, the public can ask anything they want to, and they expect that you're going to respond. The County Office of Education has oversight responsibility, and can, as I think you stated, Ms. Moore, can indeed stop the processing of a warrant if they think that something is not happening at the appropriate level. If action for a change order, as example, hasn't been taken by a Board of Education. Then, of course, we have the OPSC audit and the community at large. The school districts, especially the smaller they are, the greater the light bulb on them. School districts and their boards and superintendents live in a fishbowl. Everything that they do is seen, and the public wants to know why something isn't built on time or why there's been some change. And during the period from 2004 through 2007, when we had the skyrocketing construction costs, we saw that happening over and over again because districts weren't able to build all the projects that they intended. The letter that I provided to you, and I won't go, you want to conclude soon, Senator, I won't go into all of this, but basically it identifies the background of Senate Bill 50. And Senate Bill 50 intended to relieve the state of liability for district actions and to provide districts in exchange for that flexibility in how they used dollars provided under the state grants. We have, and we've said this at allocation board meetings and elsewhere, we see the spirit of SB 50 being eroded. And I would really ask if you would read the letter, because I think it provides some good background there. But even the Department of Finance at the time SB 50 was rolling through identified that we're giving districts discretion as to what to do with their dollars. And in fact, we expect that they can build more facilities because they have that discretion than they would under the old program. And we believe, and Mr. Bloom was talking about savings, we believe that the savings issue is really there for the district to determine what it's doing. If the project is built, and that's demonstrated, if the classrooms that were identified, at least that number were built, if the site that was identified for purchase is purchased, and if the district has matched dollar for dollar what the state expected it to match, we believe that those are the criteria that need to be looked at in an audit. Now, we began to hear from school districts that there were other things that were happening. As a result of that, we asked Mr. Cook and his staff if we could have a meeting with some school district folks, and we had a meeting and attached some summary conclusions from that meeting. So we learned because of this meeting about the changes, and we think that's an issue. If indeed there is to be some significant change, and we don't necessarily agree with what we were told, but if indeed there is to be some significant change, Senate Bill 50 identified that the Allocation Board has the authority to generate regulations to guide and manage the program. You asked the question, Senator, and I think the answer was a vague answer. The Allocation Board really never had an opportunity to act upon this. Right. And I appreciated Mr. Cook's comment about a district that had an issue that they had to look internally, and so they started looking within OPSC as to did they miss something, and that now has extended out to school districts. We really would like to have a dialogue about what that means. We're not afraid of talking about audits. We don't think school districts should be stopped in their tracks, especially at this time when they're losing general fund dollars and losing personnel, to arrange for meetings with OPSC and then have some cancellations. We had a call yesterday about that. Have cancellations when they prepare documents and have personnel ready. So we think there needs to be equal respect on each side. The question of the full and final apportionment that was identified with SB 50 identified that the district comes to the board and the district cannot come back for any additional money. It's full and it's final. Well, it sounds to me that full and final seems to be working only one way because of the level of the audits that are going on. And I think we need to dialogue about that as well. I would ask that if indeed there is some turning back of the clock to prior to 1998 with SB 50, if the state is going to be in asking more questions and asking for more information, does that not mean that the state is accruing some liability if a district makes a mistake? Or maybe it could be that the district could ask that their auditor look at what OPSC provided and determine that maybe OPSC missed something in the district because of the quickness of moving through to the approval phase with the 15-day and the 4-day letters. If maybe some dollars that OPSC neglected to provide to the district can now be provided to them in this audit. Just in conclusion, I think it's important that we continue the dialogue. And Senator Lowenthal, I really appreciate the fact that you have initiated this, because I don't think we could have this kind of dialogue at an allocation board meeting. But there needs to be a balance. It almost appears that from hearing from the state agency that they have a superior position over school districts and understand more than districts do. And I don't believe that. I think that at the state level there are certain interests, at the local level there are certain interests, and everybody's busy, but we need to work at some level of trust, and that means a dialogue. So that we shouldn't be hearing from our member districts that this is happening. We should hear it directly from the state agency that brings something to the allocation board. Thank you very much. I conclude.
Thank you very much. I look forward to continuing this dialogue.
I do have a question.
Oh, yes. We do have two more speakers.
Okay. And
Mr.
Duffy.
Come on. Why don't you come on up, and then there's a question for Mr. Duffy. You can stay.
Could you comment on the intent of SB 50, which I think you've made a little bit of comment on, and I share in some of that, having been around for a long time, about what was given up on the district side for less state participation and what some of those trade-offs were, and then the evolution of the executive order, and yours and district's kind of viewpoint of that, how we have that history, and then we have the executive order, and how we may work within the context of both.
That's an interesting question, and you made me harken back a couple of years ago. The prior state architect, there was an executive order that all agencies basically be high performance, be green. And the prior state architect approached us and said, school district projects must meet this. And we said, no. If the state isn't funding it and it isn't happening through legislation, we're not a state agency. School districts are not state agencies. They're local agencies that, like cities, have their own governing board, which is a quasi-legislative body. So the state architect didn't pursue that. We believe that the executive order really addresses some interesting things like the quality question you asked earlier, but it has to do with state agencies. It doesn't have to do with local agencies receiving grant funds that were established and connected with things like developer fees and all the complexities. We don't think that executive order really applies to school districts. And I know we will have a different viewpoint expressed by OPSC and maybe the Department of Finance as well. But where else has an executive order applied to school districts? And I don't know of any other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lowenthal and members of the subcommittee. I'm Amy Starr, the Operations Director for the San Joaquin County Office of Education. I'd like to bring up a comment relative to timeframes. We've talked about historical issues. I think there's past historical, like more than 2 or 3 years ago. There's near historical, which is the 2 or 3 year time frame, which seems to be where there's a lot of the bump and grind occurring, and then there's prospective. And I think that in the past historical, the OPSC audits certainly felt like audits to me when you're sitting out there in the district with OPSC auditors digging through the boxes. And I can't think of any other program that we have in the school district, with the exception of possibly some categorical programs, where we actually provide every expenditure on every project. And so they certainly did feel like audits to us in the field. I think that it's important to note that it's the near term where I think the bump and grind is occurring, and I would agree with other statements that have been made that communication is the key there. For example, I happened to be perusing the OPSC website and ran across the project closeout guide over a year ago, and it just appeared on the website. I couldn't dig back to where it had come forward. Had anyone been told about it? Did we get a letter or anything? It's a useful document, but there are some things in there that I would have liked to have discussed relative to here's how it really happens. So that's just one example. I think that the new day is what is causing us the issue. Where has any information been provided to districts that there is even a new day coming forward, and what in fact is that new day? When did it start, and what does it mean? If we know in advance that things are changing, we have the opportunity to discuss it, to look at it, and even to just know it's happening and be able to respond to it in a timely manner when we're supposed to be implementing it. I think that one example that's been brought forward is the entrance interview. I've just closed out 3 projects, which I have to compliment OPSC and say thank you. They went the fast track. That was wonderful for them and wonderful for us, and I appreciate that application of the new day in that regard. But the entrance interview, I've got 8 other projects that I've sent in for closeout. Well, it would be useful to have some information at the start of that process that here's what we're going to do, here's the time frames that are going to apply, and here's what we're going to be doing. On the positive side, the auditor that has been assigned to my projects has been extremely communicative, and at that level has been very, very good to work with. And I'm going to have some issues, but he's been very good informing me about what they are and what some of my options are. So I think there's some good things that are happening, too, with the staff auditors. And I would like to, this has been mentioned before, I would like to reiterate that there is a distrust that comes up between school districts, the agency, sometimes even with the allocation board, and I believe a lot of it comes out of some, not just in communication or non-communication, but just some resentment with things like the implication that districts are going to misspend state funds, and therefore we have to dig to make sure and find those that do and prevent those that might be doing it in the future, and using terms like slush fund. The fact that that may have been meant to apply to savings was new information to me because I've heard it in other public contexts, and it was much broader than that, that school districts just might squirrel away the money and misspend it. And that creates a great deal of resentment, which makes it very hard to have a working relationship. And in closing, I'd like to say that there are really 3 areas that are moving forward and looking forward that I can see. One is the concept that there's a goal that this subcommittee will come forward with to the allocation board relative to audits. And I'd like to see, once that goal is formulated, that it also moves forward into the hardship arena. That whole audit area at the beginning of the process and in the end is one that's been discussed extensively. It still has a lot of discussion to go, and I don't think that's appropriate to bring forward at this present time, but it does need to come forward. I think second, looking at what are time consumers for both districts and for the state, interest and savings were 2 that were brought up. Those might need some special attention, and I would agree with the recommendations of Ms. Boggs, and having worked with both interest and savings extensively over about a long period of time since the inception of the program, I think there are ways to meet everyone's objectives, but maybe those kinds of things have a little separate group or discussion. And I think it's important to review codes and regulations for things that might not be working out the way we all thought they would when they were first adopted. By way of example, I would point to material and inaccuracies. Maybe there are some things there where the onus and the penalty far outweighs the measure of protection that it was first put into place. And I bring up the Lammersville issue that the board dealt with some months ago, that maybe some of those things need to be looked at, because those are things that the closeout audit at OPSC really spends some time on. And they should, but OPSC's time shouldn't be wasted on things where the measure of protection doesn't balance out. And with that, that would close my statements.
Thank you. Next witness.
I'll try to keep it very short. My name is Richard Gonzalez of Richard Gonzalez and Associates. I'd like to start out that saying that the smaller the school district is, the fewer the staff are there, the more that they have to multitask, and those multitasks include the work of not only the CBO, but the superintendent and other folks on the staff. And to bring forward lots of changes, to amend the program, they just have no means to be able to keep track of all that. And if you're talking about a very small school district that starts its planning a year before it does its planning, goes through a 3-year, if it's an elementary school, through the apportionment process and construction phase, and then goes through a few more years of doing an audit closeout, they can't keep track. It's just very difficult for them. They do have the support of the county superintendents. They have other professionals that can assist them. But, you know, it just happens with a very small district. What I will also say is that there was language, as I understand, in the program, and I think it's in the law, that says that if the OPSC doesn't begin an audit process within 6 months, that the audit is deemed to be closed. Okay? Well, 6 months from when? Well, from the date that they've turned in their 100% audit. So now we're talking about a school district that's turned in an application, received an apportionment within 3 years or 4 years for a secondary school. They have to turn in that 100% audit. Ideally, 6 months within that time period, the OPSC has had a chance to determine their risk. I think that was the intent of that particular bill or language. There's a risk assessment. If the risk is very low, it's out. If the risk is high, we should do an audit. What we're finding right now is everybody's getting a pro forma letter that says, oh, by the way, you're being assigned to an auditor, and they're probably going to be asking for these kinds of documents, and now the clock is stopped. That 6-month requirement has been met because they have notified the district that the audit has begun, and yet we don't know when they'll actually come out and ask us for the final documents or when the formal review will really begin. I think that's as much as I want to share with you today, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Kathleen?
I didn't have any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank everyone. Do you want to sum up? Do you want to say anything? I can just say that I think we're just now talking to each other and letting everyone else out there that I think we've learned a lot. I think we have to begin to pare down and begin to look at just what are the key issues that we should be addressing, what models are out there. You know, Scott identified what his key issue was, he stepped back and said, maybe OPSC shouldn't be doing audits at all. That's where he's coming from. I just like the idea of better communication, of clarity. I think we all do, of making sure, and I also like the idea that following the spirit of SB 50 too, that we're really partners. And how do we enhance that? Each has a role, each has responsibility, but we don't look at this as a hierarchical process. That's really where I'm coming from. And how can we make this work? That we have is the transparency and the openness that we need to have, that we build that in, and at the same time we make sure that we don't make it such an onerous thing that everyone is kind of at odds with each other. I think there have been tremendous steps forward. I think that OPSC has indicated that in the last 2 years they have looked at this very issue and have come up with, after looking at their own procedures and what goes on, how to improve upon those procedures, and I think that's admirable, and I think they should be applauded by it. But I also think there's a role for the state allocation, as I said earlier, there's a role for the state allocation board in this also. It's not just OPSC, and sometimes those terms are interchangeable. My understanding is that OPSC staffs the state allocation board, and that decision-making should be at the state allocation board. And that's where I'm always going to come from, because that's why I'm here and spending my time as a state legislator who's on the state allocation board. So that's why I want to hold these hearings and I want to clarify these issues. Thank you.
Senator Lowenthal, I think that you've summarized it very well today. The comments that I would make are, one, I really appreciate having the hearing, and I appreciate the participation of everyone in the hearing, both the staff and also the state auditor. I think we're very honored to have had the state auditor come before us today. The time of people that are subject to the audits to come forward and discuss with us. And I think it's a great first step in looking at this issue. I think all of us, and I can speak for the subcommittee, I heard from the questions that they said today, and I think the state allocation board in general, we're very concerned with transparency and being able to tell our constituencies how bond funds are being expended. I think it's how we get to that, and how what is the best level that expends state dollars in terms of the auditing function, and district dollars in terms of the auditing function, to get to the goal that we want to achieve in terms of assessing risk and identifying those areas that maybe we need to look at more. I'm interested in that, because we know that every dollar that's expended on administrative purposes is not expended on capital purposes, and I think that's where we want to ensure that the most money possible is going into capital purposes, yet we are accountable and we are transparent. And I think that transparency works both for districts and for us as the state and as a body. We owe that transparency, and that transparency is owed to us. So I'm very hopeful that we will get there, and I'm very appreciative of the information that came forward today. Many of you did not see, but I'm very complimentary of Susan Ronbach and Mayvon Garrity. I mean, we got a ton of information here from a lot of different sources that we'll be wading through as well, that I think all is in the interest of having a good process in the end. And my final comment would be, one of the themes that I heard today, and I hope that we all, us included at the state allocation board level, are communicative with each other and with the districts. That seems to be a large issue, and I think that it can have a lot of positive impact on this trust issue, is that things are clearly communicated both ways, and therefore we have a good system that people know what the expectation is, and that is communicated, and whatever school districts do is also communicated well to the state. So I look forward to further hearings and moving this forward.
Thank you. With that, not seeing anyone else wishing to address the subcommittee, this subcommittee is adjourned.